All right, everybody, this is kind of an unusual time for me, but what the heck? A new video just dropped, and the first thing they talk about is a response to me. So, of course, naturally, I have to react to it. So, welcome, everybody. We have nobody in the comments, so I guess we'll wait on the Lancelot. But in the meantime, let's just get started with the video. So, it looks like a new channel, and I'll show you the channel. It's called Morian Shifter, which is a great name for a channel. Some of the names that I've seen mentioned on the channel, I think I might have spoken to these people before, but I can never keep track and I'm not exactly sure. But for the people running this channel, if you want to talk to me, you're clearly familiar with me, and I think I'm familiar with you. I didn't see anybody say who their names were. Anyway, you're welcome to reach out. I'd be happy to come on your channel too. And they only have 3 subscribers, and I'm one of them. So go subscribe to this channel and start getting them some views. And if you leave comments, it looks like they've interviewed Eric Sampson and Mike Humor. So the people that I argue against a lot. So if you do leave a comment, please be polite. Again, I don't always practice what I preach. I'm not always polite myself, but I don't want to be responsible for people from my channel being jerks. If I'm going to be a jerk, that's on me. So let's get into the discussion. And Beef Brain, are you new? You look like you're familiar with my stuff, but I haven't seen you before. If I have, and I forgot, I'm sorry. You get 1,000 Lancelot. Kamo gets 500, and we don't have a third person yet. But let's just get straight into the video. It's all set up, so we'll just get going.
Okay, awesome. All right. Hi, everybody. Today I'm joined here by our very esteemed guest, Dr. Eric Sampson. Dr. Sampson is a professor of philosophy at Purdue. Is there anything you want to say to introduce yourself further than that?
And no, Silk, you're in for the 250 Lancelot, so that closes out the Lancelot for today. And Beef Brain says, I'm a longtime lurker. Great. Well, I'm glad you popped in for a comment.
No, I've been at Purdue 4 years. I mainly do ethics and meta-ethics, a little epistemology and political philosophy. And I just love talking about this kind of stuff.
All right. Thank you so much for being on today. Really appreciate it. This kicks off a great series of interviews that we're going to have. So the first topic that I want to talk to you about is actually your paper on Morian shifts in response to error theory that you published, I think, a few years ago in the Oxford Journal of Metaethics.
Yep.
Yeah. So, okay, the first thing that I want to ask about, this is a quote from the paper. First, the intuition for the Morian claim that it's morally wrong to stab someone for interrupting you is, for the overwhelming majority of people at least, far clearer and more forceful than the conjunction of premises and
Hold on. I want to make sure I got it the exact phrasing
from the paper. First, the intuition for the Morian claim that it's morally wrong to stab someone for interrupting you is, for the overwhelming majority of people at least, far clearer and more forceful than the conjunction of premises in the error theoretic argument, even after careful consideration. Now, that's the end of the quote. What
Notice something about this quote. Take a look at the quote.
Is actually your paper on Morian shifts in response to error theory that you published, I think, a few years ago in the Oxford Journal of Metaethics.
Yep.
Yeah. So, okay, the first thing that I want to ask about, this is a quote from the paper. First, the intuition for the Morian claim that it's morally wrong to stab someone for interrupting you is, for the overwhelming majority of people at least, far clearer and more forceful than the conjunction of premises in the error theoretic argument, even after careful consideration.
Notice, so the intuition for the Morian claim that it's morally wrong to stab someone for interrupting you, I think he might have said just for interrupting you. Notice the language, that it's morally wrong to stab someone for interrupting you. Is that meta-ethical language? No. Is there any explicit meta-ethical terminology there, like stance independently wrong, objectively wrong, observer independently wrong, mind independently wrong? No, there's none of that. But notice how it's paired with a response to error theory. Now, error theorists and realists typically, well, not typically, they do share the same semantics. They both agree that the first order normative moral language that people employ, like it's morally wrong to stab someone, or it's morally good to stab someone, whatever the language might be, presupposes implicitly some type of realism, that when a person is making these sorts of claims, they are purporting to refer to or describe these stance independent moral facts. And so in the context, I haven't looked at, I might have read the paper a while ago, but I don't have the paper on hand. In the context of contrasting an error theoretic view with a realist view, it's totally fine to implicitly presuppose that language implies or involves or purports to be realist in character. That's fine. But what you'll notice as this conversation proceeds, I listened to about the first 10 minutes of it, is that both Eric Sampson and the person interviewing him don't draw a clear distinction between first order first order and second order, or in other words, normative and metaethical considerations. And they both end up mischaracterizing my position and repeatedly conflating that distinction. And so I think, well, in the context of that language, it might have been okay, like in the context of the paper that is being quoted from. In the context of this discussion, the failure to be explicit about the metaethical presuppositions one takes to be implicit in first order or normative moral discourse, the failure to be explicit about that results in these conflations, errors, misattributions, and confusions, as we will see.
Now, that's the end of the quote. What would you say in response to maybe some of the anti-realist worries? Someone like, a la Lance Bush, like that's empirically
That's me.
determined. We don't really have license to say whether the overwhelming majority of people actually believe in the Morian premise.
So it's unclear without looking at the paper what the Morian premise is supposed to be, because from the quote, all we have is the first order claim. Is the Morian premise that the Morian claim is that it stands independently morally wrong to stab someone for interrupting you? This is going to be extremely important here, because I do not hold the position that it's not the case that most people think it's wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. I'm entirely fine with just granting for the sake of argument, or even just presuming that it's true, that most people would consider it wrong in some sense to stab someone just for interrupting you. Certainly, I think if you surveyed everybody on the planet today, you would hit at least 50% of people would agree it's bad or it's wrong or it's immoral to stab someone just for interrupting you. So my official position is it's probably the case that the vast majority of people, way over 50% currently in the world, and probably historically, do think it's morally wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. Okay? So to make it even shorter, I think most people think it's wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. I do think that they think that. Okay? So second, and this is also important, I do not think that you need to conduct some sort of peer-reviewed study to figure that out. So we'll get into some of the things Eric Sampson says here, but I'm already getting ahead of myself. I would say some of the same things myself.
Yeah, the premise that you shouldn't stab somebody for interrupting you or something like that.
You see? Oh, the premise that you shouldn't stab someone just for interrupting you? Misleading, conflation, misrepresentation of my position. I don't think it's the case that most people don't think it's wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. And that has very little to do with what my position on this is. They are not drawing a clear distinction between it being stance independently wrong and it being wrong. Why are they not drawing this distinction? Eric Sampson specializes in metaethics. Whoever is discussing this with him presumably has read my content, and not only have I been very, very clear that my position is that most people are not moral realists, I've also repeatedly pointed out that people keep conflating normative or first order and second order or metaethical considerations and mixing them up and conflating them. So in other words, not only am I not saying the thing that is misleading being attributed to me here, I've repeatedly pointed out that I'm not doing so, and yet people continue to misconstrue my position. Now, at this point, I think I'm entitled to be a little bit pissed off about it, because I am crystal clear about this. Crystal clear. In fact, to the point where I'm annoying myself with how many times I've had to repeat ad nauseum that there's a difference between it's wrong to X and it stands independently wrong to X. And I've made it very clear that my position is that we do not have good empirical evidence that most people think it's stance independently wrong to do whatever the action might be. And that it's not just that it's about beliefs. This is another thing. Sometimes people go, well, experimental philosophy just looks at people's beliefs or their explicit positions. We're interested in the implicit semantics. No. Go look at my dissertation, where I explicitly draw a distinction between stances and commitments. I operationalize and propose technical terms and draw a distinction between implicit commitments and features of our language independent of our explicit views or our metalinguistic positions or anything like that. So that those stances would cover stuff like the folk semantics. And then I talk about those are commitments. And then I talk about stances, which would be people's explicit beliefs, which don't even have to be fully articulable in propositional terms where they actually would say, I'm a realist. They could just have a view that's realist and not have a label for it. So I already draw a distinction between commitments, which covers all the stuff philosophers are typically interested in, or frequently interested in, and stances, which are the more explicit things. Now, it's also just not true that experimental philosophy only looks at stances. It looks at both stances and commitments, depending on the study in question. So it does look at both, and it does look at semantics. So the notion that I take the work that's often considered the sort of founding study of experimental philosophy, the semantics cross-cultural style, I think it is. And in any case, it's the one looking at what are they called? Gettier cases. Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch from 2001. That's looking at people's sort of implicit concept of knowledge. It's not looking at explicit beliefs. Now, it uses meta-linguistic judgments about cases to reveal insights into people's underlying implicit concept. But that's exactly what philosophers do. I mean, they're literally giving people a thought experiment. Philosophers themselves use thought experiments to engage in the process of self-discovery about what they take the concepts to be. So, there are misconstruals of experimental philosophy. It hasn't come up here, but I'm heading off those sorts of misconstruals which people sometimes make. But in any case, notice what Sampson says here.
Whether,
to be fair to Sampson, he is just responding to the quote and what the person is
overwhelming
presenting.
majority of people actually believe in the Morean premise.
So the issue here is that they're just not clear on what the Morean premise is. Is the Morean premise a first order claim that it's wrong to stab people for interrupting you? Is it a second order and first order claim sort of bundled together that it stands independently wrong to stab people just for interrupting you? Or is it some sort of inchoate or undifferentiated notion that it's wrong antecedent to any particular conceptual analysis, which is what, sometimes I've had the impression Enoch and Humer and others want to get to render judgments or intuitions about statements like it's wrong to stab people just for fun, or it's wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you, prior to any consideration of how that's analyzed, whether in a realist or anti-realist way. Now, it's fine if they hold positions like that, and I don't know Sampson's position on that, but I don't think language and meaning work that way, so I wouldn't take a position on that. And so even if that's what they think, I don't take a position on that. And so it wouldn't be accurate to attribute any particular position that most people think one way or another about that, because I don't think people think about things in that way at all. In other words, if you take the statement, it's wrong to stab people just for interrupting you, I think your options would be limited to something indeterminate, something determinately realist, or something determinately anti-realist. And what I don't think is that you have this two-step process of you first analyze, do they agree yes or no with that? Then you look at whether, okay, and then in virtue of a bunch of other considerations, now we consider whether they're a realist or an anti-realist. I want to sort of pin down the content of what it is the person endorses prior to consideration of whether they endorse it or not. Like, in other words, I think there needs to be some specific thing for the person to endorse in order to consider whether they endorse it or not. I don't think you first secure agreement with a sentence and then you figure out what the sentence means, which is what some people seem to want to do. So if they want to do that, I reject that. I mean, it's fine in the sense that they're allowed to do that, but I'm not required to analyze sentences or use the same analytic procedures that they do. So I would take it's wrong to do something just for fun to be, it's wrong to stab someone for interrupting you to be indeterminate, metaethically speaking, without explicit specification from the person. So in order for me to assess whether most people think it's wrong to stab people just for interrupting you, I need to know what you mean. What are you asking the person? Are you asking them whether it stands independently wrong? Are you asking them where it stands dependently wrong? Are you asking them about their emotional position on the matter? Are you asking them if they prescribe that people not do it? Are you asking them if they were to say in response, yes, it is wrong, that they would be issuing an imperative, a universalized imperative in accordance with R.M. Hare's account? Like, what I would want to know is, which account are you attributing to the person? Which account are they agreeing to or disagreeing with? I don't think it makes any sense to ask what they agree or disagree to independent of any particular account. It'd be a bit like asking someone, imagine I have a fruit in a box and I want to know whether people like the fruit, and I refuse to tell you which fruit it is. It could be a banana, it could be a mango, it could be durian. Well, the answer to do people like this fruit or not, or does any particular person like this fruit or not, or do most people like this fruit or not, depends on what the fruit is. You can't first say either most people like the fruit or not, then we figure out what the fruit is. That doesn't make any sense. Does it make sense? Okay.
Yeah, the premise that you shouldn't stab somebody for interrupting you or something like that.
Yeah, just kind of any of those common sense Morian style.
Again, they're not being clear. What the heck is a common sense Morian intuition?
Judgments, yeah.
And notice the language, common sense. What do they mean by common sense? Do they mean something that most people endorse? Or is that some sort of epistemic, like normative epistemic claim? They're not being specific or clear on what they mean by this terminology.
Yeah, I guess I think, well, so first of all, I mean, I would just start by saying, when I'm doing philosophy, I'm trying to figure out what I think about this stuff.
Okay, so he says what I'm trying to do is figure out what he thinks. But the quote was about what most other people think, wasn't it? Let's look at the quote.
In response to maybe some of the fold in the conjunction of premise. This is a quote from the paper. First, the intuition for the Morian claim that it's morally wrong to stab someone for interrupting you is, for the overwhelming majority of people at least.
For the overwhelming majority of people. So notice how, and this happened with Enoch too. I'll start saying stuff like what most people think is an empirical question. And you don't know what most people think unless you run a study or unless you have empirical evidence. Now, not all empirical evidence requires peer-reviewed studies. This is important to emphasize. So they'll say in a paper, most people think this way, but then the first thing they say when asked is, well, I'm primarily concerned with what I think. That's fine. You're welcome to start with what you think, but any attempt to generalize from what you think to what other people think requires some epistemic procedure, maybe some inferential process. On what basis do you generalize from what you think to what other people think? Because imagine, a psychopath became an analytic philosopher. There's questions about whether I think there's legitimate questions about whether psychopathy is real. But just imagine a person that's like super evil or something, and they love torturing people, and they're super impulsive. And you ask them, consult your intuitions. Is it okay to stab someone for interrupting you? And that person might say, yeah, I do that all the time. Right. So, let's say you were asking people in an honor culture, or let's say you were asking the king of a country in 2322 BCE. Is it okay to stab people for interrupting you? The king might say, are you kidding? I wouldn't even bother stabbing them. I'd have one of my aides decapitate that person. Yeah, you don't interrupt the king. Are you fucking kidding me? I'm divinely mandated by the god Hupatan. I don't know. So, if Hupatan has invested you with the divine right of kings, people better not interrupt you. So there certainly are contexts in which a person would think it's perfectly natural to stab someone just for interrupting you. Are those the majority of people? Of course not. And they never have been, because this isn't a view anybody realistically holds in large proportions. It's just there's something quite strange about shifting from most people think this, everybody thinks this, almost all people think this, to then going, well, here's what I think. Okay, that's great. Now, how do we get from what you think to what most people think?
Far clearer and more forceful than the conjunction of premises in the error theoretic argument, even after careful consideration. Now, that's the end of the quote.
So you have this further claim, right? So one empirical claim would be most people have the intuition that it stands independently wrong to stab somebody just for interrupting you, or whatever the claim might be. A second empirical claim is a much more complicated counterfactual claim. It's more of a prediction. It's not one that we could easily get data on. That basically says, if you took one of these people and you put them through the philosophical process of inquiry, and you took that starting, say, realist intuition, and you compared the strength of their intuition in favor of that with the strength of their intuition in response to the conjunction of claims that favor error theory, that the strength of their intuitive support for the former would be greater than the latter. That's also an empirical claim. And we don't know the answer to that claim. And it would be effectively impossible to test that claim on lay populations, because if you put someone through that process, like the process of reflecting on the conjunction of premises that support error theory, for them to properly understand all those and consider them and reflect on them appropriately, removes them from the pool of people that are members of the population of non-philosophers, the untrained people that have naive intuitions about the matter. I also want to flag another issue here. Notice how philosophers will characterize intuition in some respects as a sort of non-inferential, sort of this sort of immediate, spontaneous, non-inferential reaction to something that is taken to be, in many cases, pre-theoretical. It's taken to be common sense. It's taken to be part of the way that the people out there, like just the general person, thinks about these sorts of things. So one type of thing is the intuition. The ordinary person out there, the one way of thinking about intuition is that person thinks there's an external world. That person thinks some things are objectively right or wrong, morally speaking. That person thinks we're capable of having knowledge under certain conditions and not under others. That person thinks we have free will. These are all supposed to be fairly straightforward, simple cases about which a person can have an intuition in a relatively unreflective manner. But this is now being compared to our quote unquote intuition in response to the conjunction of premises that support error theory. Well, that's not, how the hell could those possibly be the same sorts of things? Because the psychological processes involved in having a judgment or having some sort of quote unquote intuitive reaction to a set of premises that support a complicated philosophical position, there is no good reason to think that that's the same type of psychological state or the same type of process or phenomena as what you would get from a person's sort of immediate, spontaneous, non-inferential reaction to a matter that's already supposedly implicit and built into lay considerations. After all, error theory is by design not a lay theory, because it's a theory that is a conjunction of an empirical thesis about lay people, hey, lay people are realists, and a metaphysical thesis, hey, those lay people that are realists, they're wrong about the metaphysics. And that second component is not and cannot be part of the ordinary thought, because it can't be part of ordinary thought that everybody thinks morality is objective, but it's not objective, because then the first part of that wouldn't be true. You know, this is already a pretty significant error, you know, to make this claim that you know, these are both something that you have intuitions about. That's just not how these sorts of things work, because what you would have to be doing is equivocating on what you mean by intuition, or using intuition in such a loose way it's unclear what intuition refers to. So it's a problem either way, and it's a pretty significant problem. Okay.
What would you say in response to maybe some of the anti-realist worries, someone like, you know, a la Lance Bush, like that's empirically underdetermined.
Oh, right. We got to go ahead.
We don't really have license. That's it. Is
That,
yeah, just kind of any of those common sense Morian style judgments. Yeah.
yeah, I guess I think, well, so first of all, I mean, I would just start by saying, when I'm doing philosophy, I'm trying to figure out what I think about this stuff. So I can start with me, and I can just tell you that nothing seems, you know, there are very few things that seem clearer than that to me. And I guess I just think, you know, there are many things you don't need a peer-reviewed study to know, just like common sense truths about, you know, what people think about things. So, you know, most people, you know, you can trust that they're probably not gonna swerve off into oncoming traffic. That's why most of us get on the road and we continue to carry on, you know, driving, and we aren't, you know, nervous about getting on the roads. At least we're not worried that somebody's going to slam into us every time we get on the road. And there's not like a bunch of peer-reviewed studies that, you know, show like, you know, we don't need a peer-reviewed study to see that kind of thing. You know, people often point out that when you jump out of a plane, you know, they haven't done peer-reviewed studies to show like, you know, we're going to let some people jump out of a plane with no.
Just as an aside, I have repeatedly made this point myself, that you do not need peer-reviewed studies to make every point. And I've specifically used the example that you don't need to test whether falling out of a plane would be fatal or not. So notice that Eric Sampson is making a point that's supposed to be a critical response to my position. And he's appealing to points and considerations that I make in response to the mistaken view that you need peer-reviewed studies to confirm everything. I've explicitly said this on record. So I'm being criticized by appeal to points and considerations that I myself employ to make the exact same point that he's making here. So what are the odds that I hold a view subject to this criticism? Effectively negligible. I don't hold the view that you need a peer-reviewed study for everything. Now, what Eric and I might disagree about is whether you need a specific peer-reviewed study or series or literature of studies or some type of empirical evidence specifically to assess a particular question. But I don't know what Eric thinks the question is. I specifically reject the notion that ordinary people are implicitly committed to or explicitly endorse moral realism. All he's dealing with right now, apparently, is the notion that most people think it's wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. Now, that particular claim is metaethically underdetermined. I don't know whether he has a particular metaethical reading of that. Some of the language he's used implies that you would have a particular meta-ethical reading of that, but it's unclear. So what I want to know is why interviewers and Eric and other people are just consistently not clear. What specific claim are they attributing to ordinary people? What specific position do they take to be common sense? A normative one or a meta-ethical one or both? Why can't they be clear about this? I don't have any difficulty being clear about this. Freshmen about moral relativism, and I go over the ambiguities and difficulties with them, and I have them find this distinction by the end of the semester. So if I could teach 18-year-olds that are not even majoring in philosophy to do it, why can't professional philosophers be clear about this? Why? So again, am I not justified in being kind of a little bit annoyed by this, that this just persists? So they're probably, one or both of them will probably see this. Tisk, tisk. Just be clear about this. Just be clear about what claims you're making. Now, if you think it's obvious, that's fine. But you're producing a video on YouTube. You know, this is not for a technical audience. So I'm not even clear on what you mean. I could guarantee you an audience isn't clear on what you mean. And sure, they'll have some people that are sympathetic to their view say, it was clear to me. I could go run a study and show that it's not clear to most people. But it is formally ambiguous. And people might make inferences or lean in a particular direction, and you might get a majority. But you're still, that does not mean that something is clear. So, yeah. Anyway, let's keep going.
Parachute, and others, we're going to let them jump out with a parachute, and we'll just see who likes. Like, you don't need a peer-reviewed study to know you need a parachute, or you're going to die. So I guess I think I don't think I need a peer-reviewed study asking, you know, do people out there think that you shouldn't go around stabbing people for interrupting you? I guess I think if you're really in doubt about that, I guess I think, yeah, go get a peer-reviewed study. I mean, I'll let.
By the way, I have to pause this to formally announce the following. We just hit 3,000 right now. Woo! Is there some sort of celebration thing that we could put on here? Do I have celebration backgrounds? I have a bunch of Halloween stuff from back when I was doing backgrounds for Halloween. I don't have any celebration stuff. What is that? Oh, Boxing Day. Okay. Halloween stuff. Hey, Halloween's not too far away. Yeah, see a bunch of Halloween stuff. All right, we'll put the big Lance Independent symbol. 3,000! Woo! All right, thank you everybody for supporting this channel. It's been a long road to 3,000, but Halloween is kind of like a celebration. Just do a dance, it'll work. There is zero chance I'll do a dance. Let's have a look at the chat. We got a congrats, we got clapping. Can I be one of your reviewers? Reviewers of what? For what? It's ambiguous. 20face says it's ambiguous if you're a philosopher, I think. I think it's also ambiguous for non-philosophers. It's very unclear. If you ask an ordinary person without philosophical training, is it wrong to stab a person in the face for interrupting you? It would be very weird to think that they would specifically interpret that in a distinctively and exclusively meta-ethical way. Part of the problem with that sort of question is, even if you don't specify, let's go back to the question. Take the statement. It's wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. Okay, so you present that statement to an ordinary person and ask them whether they agree or disagree. Even if you have a realist interpretation of that, even if what you're asking them is it stance independently wrong to stab someone just for fun? What you're doing, or sorry, I keep saying just for fun because I'm so used to that. Even if it's you are asking them, is it stance independently wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you? Even if you ask the realist question there, notice that you're asking a complex question. You're asking them, is it wrong in a way that has this particular property? And when you do that, you're asking two questions at once. Is it wrong? And the sense in which is wrong, is that sense stance independent? Now, I've talked about this before. If you say yes to that, you're saying yes to both questions at once. You have a 2x2 matrix, right? You have yes, morality is objective, and yes, stabbing someone for interrupting you is wrong. You also have yes, morality is objective, but no, stabbing someone for interrupting you is not morally wrong. Then you have no, morality is not objective, but yes, it's wrong to stab someone just for fun, and no, or sorry, for interrupting you. No, morality is not objective, and no, it's not wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. If you say in response to the question, is it stance independently wrong to stab someone for interrupting you? You're saying yes, yes. If you say no, you could endorse any one of the other three positions. This is a bad question. And it's a bad question because it does not allow the person that gives a no response to disambiguate their normative moral position from their metaethical position. So hopefully the person would at least think this if they say no to the question, is it wrong to stab someone just for fun? Or sorry, for interrupting you. Shit, I'm going to keep doing that. Hopefully the person to think, no, it's not objectively wrong, or it's not stance independently wrong, but it is wrong. My first order position is that it is wrong. This is my position. My position is, no, it's not stance independently wrong, but it is wrong. But notice the problem here. You have two other possibilities. The other possibilities, if you just said no in response to this question, are you don't think anything is stance independently wrong, including stabbing people, or you do think things are stance independently wrong, but you think it's fine to stab people. So if you say no to that question, 2 out of the 3 possibilities are that you're some kind of psychopathic monster that's fine with stabbing people just for interrupting you. Ordinary people are responsive to reputational concerns. They're not stupid, and they realize saying no to that question would not be wise in most circumstances. Second, there's no easy way to respond to the question in a way that disambiguates. But third, here's the more serious problem. Notice the original dialectical framing, which is that we have a dispute between realists and error theorists. Both of them agree ordinary people presuppose realism, right? So the ordinary person, in order to properly disambiguate the complex question that Eric and his interviewer are presenting, it would require the ordinary person to have some sort of cognizance of the distinction between metaethical and normative claims, to disambiguate them, and then appropriately say something like, I don't think it stands independently wrong, but I do think it's wrong. But there's the problem. If error theory is true, the person thinks the proper semantic analysis of wrong is stance independently wrong. So they have no way to say, I don't think it stands independently wrong, but I do think it's wrong in a first order sense, because the first order sense, that the only first order sense they have available, if error theory is true, is one that presupposes realism. So the person has no way to disambiguate the question without not being subject to the error theory or the realist presuppositions about their semantics being correct in the first place. It's also highly unreasonable to think that the common sense layperson would have the philosophical sophistication to pull those two things apart in the middle of being asked that question. It's even more demanding to expect them to do so under duress in a situation where their reputation is at stake, because even hesitation in response to that question could make you look bad. Imagine you ask this to somebody, hey, are you a super duper mega racist? And the person goes, no. Right? People are going to go, huh? No, you would expect the response to go, no, of course not. Immediate, right? So a person there's even reputational cost to not responding reflexively or immediately. And we already know that people are inclined to respond to questions very, very quickly. Look at stuff like the cognitive reflection task. You ask someone, hey, a bat and a ball, the bat cost $1 more than the ball. They both add up to $1.10. How much does the bat and the ball cost? A lot of people immediately go, bat's $1, the ball is 10 cents. That's wrong. It takes impulse control and cognitive effort to pause and actually do up the calculation and go, no, actually, it's got to be that the bat's $1.05 and the ball is 5 cents, right? In order to get the right answer to that. Sorry if that's a spoiler. Oh, wait, somebody threw money at me. I got to deal with that. All right, Beef Brain. I love the name. Our longtime lurker says, congrats on 3K and has thrown $10 at me. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, especially because everybody, I am moving at the end of this week on Friday. So I will be gone. I'll probably be packing stuff up. There's no way I'm streaming the rest of the week after this. So I'll be leaving. I'll be gone on Friday. We're going to have some internet difficulties with getting internet set up there. So I'm not 100% sure how stable or good it's going to be until we get things ironed out. I'm not going to get into the details there, but I'm hoping to be back next week, hopefully on next Wednesday. So about 9 days from now, because I start teaching next week. That's on Tuesday. It's unlikely I'm going to be on here. If I'm lucky, maybe I'll be on here Sunday or Monday. Also, my dad's going to be visiting for a couple weeks. So we're going to be hanging out, going on trips, doing stuff with my daughter. So I'm not going to be as active on here for a couple weeks. But as I settle into the new home and as the semester proceeds, we'll have more time. Okay. So again, really appreciate it, Beef Brain. I'll keep that up there if you want. And if you have a question or if you want to leverage throwing money at me to say something or leave a comment, please do, and I'll post it up here. Nitty's asking, hey, have you liked the stream yet? Yeah, so do like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Appreciate it, everybody. All right. 20 Faces says, I know we can't assume, but don't you think it's fair to assume that most people who think it's only stance independently wrong would answer no? That most people think it's only stance dependently wrong would answer no. That's how I would answer, I think. No. Depending on the social context, if somebody said, no, I don't. So if somebody said, do you think it's wrong to stab people just for interrupting you? The only sense in which I think anything is wrong is stance dependently. And I would say, yeah, I do think it's wrong. But because the answer to that sounds like a first order question to me. And I don't grant the error theorist or the realist assumptions about ordinary semantics, and I don't employ ordinary semantics anyway. So my answer to that would be, yeah, it's wrong. And so would I think a lot of anti-realists would say yes to that question. So no, I don't think so. And that's another reason this is not a good question. All right. Xing Sai says, I think it's only stance dependently wrong. I would answer it is wrong. Speaking of that, let's do a poll related to this for everybody here. Okay. How would you answer it's wrong to stab someone for interrupting you? So you're going to have 4 options, which is yes, realist, no, I'm a realist. I hope nobody says that. Yes, I'm an anti-realist. And no, I'm an anti-realist. I know everybody likes the I'm not sure response, but it only allows 4 options, so too bad. All right, so let's see how people would respond to the question here. And that should give us some insight into the appropriateness of this question. Now, as I was saying, part of the issue is if you're framing this as an issue in which people are presumptively realists, right? So error theorists and realists both agree ordinary people are realists. So now when you ask the question, and actually you are presuming realism in the question, it's stance independently wrong to stab someone just for interrupting you. And then you're expecting your audience to be realists, the people responding to be realists. Okay, so if that's the framing we're going with, notice that both that the 2x2 matrix goes away because now we're ruling out anybody that would give an anti-realist response, yes or no. So now the only responses are yes, it stance independently wrong, or no, it's and I'm a realist, or no, it's not stance independently wrong, and I'm a realist. And so now notice what that forces the question to do. The question forces you to it presupposes your answer to the realist question, and then as a realist, you are a realist, and then the only thing you're responding to is the normative question. So if the purpose of this question is to elicit a person's meta-ethical position, that doesn't make any sense because the framing of the question presupposes their meta-ethical question. And then so notice again, you're assuming the question is really this: is it stance independently wrong to stab people for interrupting you? And then you're supposing that the respondent is a realist, and their only answers are yes or no. If they say yes, then you're not finding anything out new about their meta-ethical position. You're only finding out that they're morally opposed. They think among the stance independent moral facts is that it's wrong to stab people for interrupting you. Whereas if they say no, you're only finding out about their normative stance, which is that they don't think among the moral facts, stance independent moral facts, is that it's wrong to stop people just for interrupting you. So notice then that if we're going with a dialectical framing that is presumptive here, it's not technically a complex question. It's just a question that's only eliciting a person's normative moral position. But notice that it's then presupposing that the population in question are realists, and then we're only asking about the normative position. That doesn't make any sense as a way of framing my position, because my position is that it's not the case that they're realists. So what the hell? Then it's just helping itself to an assumption that I don't grant, and then asking a question that is presupposing something that it's contingent on it that I don't grant. That people are taking a position on whether it stands independently wrong or it's not stands independently wrong. I don't think ordinary people hold either position, because I don't think that they hold the determinate positions in these things at all. So now that I'm really examining and thinking this through, because I'm thinking this through in real time, the way in which they're framing this question, there's almost no win situation for them. If they disambiguated properly, then they would not be able to frame my position as thinking most people think it's not the case that most people think it's wrong to stab people for interrupting you, because if they're only dealing with it as a first order issue and we could give the anti-realist analysis, then I would just give the anti-realist analysis. Like, in other words, suppose we operationalize the question this way. Are most people opposed morally to, like, just as a first order issue, do most people oppose the notion that it would be acceptable to stab people for interrupting you? Yes, they do. Most people do. Do I think we need an empirical study, peer reviewed or otherwise, to find that out? No, I don't. So do Eric and I agree? And if so, why am I being criticized for holding a view that I don't have? Alternatively, if the question is intended to rely on the presupposition that of error theorists and realists being correct, that any response to this is it presupposes that the person is employing realist semantics, then the only thing we're finding out about people is their normative moral stance. In that case, the question is presupposing something that I reject, and the whole point of my position is a rejection of the presupposition, not the question that follows, because the question that follows on the assumption that everybody's a realist is a normative question. And I agree that in the case of the normative question, most people are morally opposed, or most people think it's morally wrong to stab people for interrupting you. It's just that I don't think that most people are realists. So you see how once you disentangle the way in which they're framing and setting this up, it's all kinds of wonky, because you can disambiguate what they're doing in several ways, and either they're not helping themselves to those assumptions, in which case it's a misleading and inaccurate presentation of my view, or they are helping themselves to the assumption, in which case it's also a misleading and inaccurate presentation of my view. So there's a pretty serious problem in the way that they're setting things up here. I'm curious for the audience. This was a bit more complicated and technical than the normal points that I make. Is this clear what the issue here is? Maybe I need to write an article in this. I'm hoping that the person that did this discussion with Eric will see what the issue is and acknowledge it. All right, let's keep going with the video.
Go do it, and then what you're going to find out, I'm almost certain, is that people think it would be wrong to do that. And then once you have the peer, if you need a peer-reviewed study to come to that kind of conclusion, then by all means go do the peer-reviewed study. But there are many things that are perfectly reasonable for people to believe, empirical things and philosophical things, and you don't need a peer-reviewed study to figure it out. I mean, it's worth noting that peer-reviewed studies are started like in the 1900s, maybe at the earliest. Before that, there weren't lots of double-blind tests for a lot of.
Yeah, that's funny. He says double-blind. I don't know. Like, just as a couple other pointers here, I've also made many of these points myself, but I'm critical of peer review, so I don't place special emphasis on peer-reviewed studies, and I never have. So it's a bit odd for him to repeatedly say peer review. Also, double-blind really wouldn't make a lot of sense in this context. Double blinding is when both the researcher and the participant are unaware of the hypothesis. It's not the researcher, the person gathering the data. So if you have a person administering a survey or asking you questions, or if a confederate or a research assistant is facilitating the study, typically what the researcher overseeing the study will want to do is ensure that they themselves are not aware of the condition to which the participant has been assigned, and or what the hypotheses of the study are, ideally both, but if nothing else, at least the condition. And the purpose of that is so that they can't subtly bias the participant or bias their interpretation of the data afterwards by having knowledge of the condition to which the participant was assigned and or the hypothesis or hypotheses being tested in the study. So what you want to do is minimize the bias of the researcher, and you want to ensure, of course, that the participant doesn't know whether they're in a control condition or an experimental condition. And you want to ensure that the participant does not know what hypothesis is being tested. If they know what condition they're in, that can screw up your results. If they know what you're testing, that could cause demand characteristics and other sorts of things that can undermine the results. So double blinding is when the participant is blind to condition and hypothesis. I think normally they focus on condition, but I think both of these are important, so I'm going to emphasize both. But typically it's usually just framed in terms of condition. So that's when the participant isn't aware and the people administering the study are not aware. Like maybe they use a code or they whatever. There's a bunch of methods you can use for blinding things. So that is typically not relevant to the way a lot of these sorts of studies are conducted, because a lot of them are typically just surveys that a person's filling out. So the participant may not be aware, so they're blind to condition if they're in different conditions. If you're giving people a survey, it's not even an experiment. You're looking at correlational research. So first of all, a lot of the research is just correlational, and so you're not even doing an experiment. And so blinding and double blinding would be irrelevant. And second, even when you are running a study, often it's like technically single blinded. So he's throwing in terms like peer review and double blind, maybe reflexively, and maybe he's just thinking of people that are like, you need double blind peer reviewed studies to prove things. I've never said that, and I don't think that. And if in fact, I'm explicitly on the record criticizing the peer review process and actually having possibly one of the most pessimistic and critical attitudes towards it of almost anybody in academia. So attributing an emphasis on peer review to me is weird and ironic, and not accurate. And an emphasis, like he throws in double blind here, but it's not typically relevant to the way that these studies are being conducted.
Empirical claims. Nevertheless, human beings got along pretty well without having these kinds of peer-reviewed studies. So I guess I think, look, there are some claims about ordinary people's beliefs and their behavior that's as evident as anything that there is. And so I guess I think if you really doubt that that people don't really hold those beliefs at all, then by all means go do the peer-reviewed studies. I guess I'm a little when people say that, like, do people really have that view? I guess I think, yeah, they do. They do. I mean, are there reasons to think they don't? I guess, like, what?
So notice that there's still not that view. He just says that view. They're still not clear on what view. If you're going to run a study, right? He's talking. Let's talk about go conduct a peer-reviewed study. In order to conduct a peer-reviewed study, why is peer-reviewed involved in this? You don't need peer review to run a study. In order to run a study, you would need to operationalize. You could ask people questions, right? You can ask people, is morality objective or not, right? But that's not a good operationalization of a measure of whether the person is a realist or not, because there's a chasm, there's a gap between what you're measuring and what you're measuring is intended to represent, reflect, or capture, right? There's a gap between the two. Just because you run a particular study and you claim the results of the study indicate some claim about the way the world is, doesn't mean that you're right. So to operationalize means to put into practice a formal set of procedures that would allow you to distinguish things in such a way where it's serving effectively as a proxy, often a very good proxy, for whatever it is you're trying to measure. And so in this case, in order to operationalize a measure of something, you need to be clear on what the something is. We cannot even begin to address the question of, do most people think X, unless we're clear on what X is. And Sampson is not clear on what it is we would be measuring. Are we measuring whether most people dislike stabbing people for interrupting you? Whether most people think, as a matter of descriptive fact, their cultures are opposed to it? Do most people, as a matter of subjective or personal preference, oppose the idea? Do most people find it objectionable or repugnant? Do most people find it morally outrageous? How are we operationalizing those? If the specific claim is that most people believe it stands independently wrong, that would be operationalized differently from, do most people employ language in a way that the best analysis of the way in which the person would respond to an appropriate question, operationalized in the proper way, in the appropriate context, would be that that person's language involves semantics that are best understood to accord with realism. That is a different operationalization than the person's metalinguistic standards. Were you to ask the person, what do you take yourself to mean when you say this? Or what do you think most people mean when they say this? You can use the former as a measure of the latter, or as a measure of their belief, or as a measure of something else. There's a difference between what you're measuring and the theoretic, the theory or the underlying construct you're attempting to capture through the measure that you're using. And there is no sensitivity to precision or clarity in the way that they're speaking about this. What exactly are they talking about? Most people think, is it a question about what they think, or is it a question about how they use language? Those are not necessarily the same thing. On some philosophical views about language, there's facts about language. Was Putnam that famously said, meaning ain't just in the head. I think, or just ain't in the head. Is it ain't just in the head or just ain't in the head? I think it's just ain't in the head. That meaning is not fully determined by psychological facts. Some people think that, some people don't think that. And so there are background philosophical views that would influence how you constructed, designed, and interpreted studies in the first place. So you would need an entire theoretical, including philosophical theories, as a background operating apparatus before you even begin to operationalize questions and then address those questions empirically. And then you would need to think through carefully how you would measure what you're trying to measure. It's not going to do, for instance, to ask people, are you a moral realist? Because a typical person isn't going to know what the hell you're asking them. And so proper study design to figure out what people think or what people are implicitly committed to is subtle, it's challenging, and it's not something to be this flippant and dismissive about as Eric Sampson is. This is not an appropriate way to handle empirical questions about how ordinary people think. This is not like the question of the fatality rates of jumping out of a plane without a parachute. Why is it not like that? Well, it's not like that because in that case, there is virtually no, and in fact, there is no actual functional serious dispute about the effects of gravity on the human body when falling from high altitudes. Any sane person agrees that if you jump out of a plane, you will splatter on the ground most likely when you hit. That's not a matter of contention. The question of whether the ordinary person is implicitly committed or explicitly endorses moral realism is a matter of contention. And we have studies with very high rates of people giving anti-realist responses. And you will get people giving anti-realist responses in response to questions that are very serious. The people will give anti-realist responses into questions about terrorism. They'll give anti-realist responses in response to questions about murder. One of the questions in the Goodwin and Darley study asked people about whether they think it would be wrong for a person to to shoot into a crowd of people. Okay. I could go look at the study. I bet we'll find at least one person giving an anti-realist response to that. In fact, fuck it. Let's pull up a study now. Let's look at a study right now, just to make the point. Anti-realist pluralism. Let's have a look at the concrete moral issues that they use. Okay, here's some of the concrete moral issues. Men who violently physically punish their children are cruel. John cheating or committing adultery on his wife Elizabeth for no other reason than boredom with his marriage is morally permissible. You have consciously discriminating against someone on the basis of their race. Martin Shkreli overpricing drugs. Martin Luther King was a righteous man. Presumably, you would want most people to say that that's true. So for the concrete measures, what do we end up getting? So that's I read most of them, not all of them. For the concrete measures, whoop, this is a sideways table. Concrete measures. Realist responses. Yeah, you have absolutely massive rates of anti-realist responses. 91% for Martin Luther King, 88% for wealth redistribution, 100% for cheating, 75% for overpricing drugs. Yeah, so I'm looking, the table's sideways because it's really long. I'd have to look at that a little more carefully. But even if I'm flipping those responses, there's only one of them where there was a 0%. And so in all of these cases except one, you don't have unanimity. And in some of these cases, it's pretty split. And again, we could look at the tail part of this where you look at the abstract measures. Oh, this has abstract and concrete measures. Yeah. So I probably was reading that correctly. So I don't know if I could show you the whole paper. Let me just show you the graph. And I've shown this table before. Do I have a way of cutting and pasting? Oh, I know what I'll do. Just put it in the Google Doc. 1 second, or a Word document. And then I'll just share the screen. All right. Let's see. Okay. So as you can see here, concrete is represented. The concrete issues are like the ones that I read, is represented by the lighter response, which is the one on the right in these cases. You had nobody gave a consistently realist response. You had about a little under, like it looks like 28, 27% of people gave an inconsistent anti-realist response. And then you had something like, 90% of people gave a consistently anti-realist response in response to the concrete cases that I gave you. So yeah, I was reading that correctly. So what we do have is empirical data for pretty serious issues that when you ask people whether they have a realist or anti-realist stance for that, they give the anti-realist response, at least in this particular study. So how is that not some evidence that Eric Sampson is wrong? Is he aware of the study? Does he care about the study? It's one thing, like, look, we could say all day long, hey, obviously we don't need to run a study to see if people would survive jumping out of a plane. But if someone said, hey, look, I just had 500 people jump out of a plane and 450 of them survived, well, I would assume, I would just assume that the paper's fraudulent and stupid. But assuming it was legitimate, we would have to reevaluate our attitudes about gravity, right? We would start reconsidering things. And so, part of the problem here is that it's not like I'm talking about hypothetical empirical data. Eric Sampson is responding as if, I was just speaking in just completely hypothetical terms. We do need studies for this. No, we already have studies for this. And what you'll see is that even the early studies, except with children, which give almost unanimous realist responses, but there's issues with that. And I have an article on that. The main issue is that adults don't understand these questions. There's no chance kids are understanding these questions. And I talk about why I think that and what the reasons for that are. And how the researchers themselves don't appear to understand the positions. So in the case of even adults don't understand these questions, and that creates a separate issue. On the assumption that these questions are at least some signal and it's not fully noise, what you get in the earliest study, so we're talking After Objectivity, a 2004 paper by Sean Nichols. You have 2008, which is probably the most important study in the field, Goodwin and Darley's 2008 paper. I think it's called Are People Moral Objectivists or something like that. And then you have subsequent studies that have followed that. So the early studies have significant methodological shortcomings that have been corrected and improved upon by Jennifer Wright, Thomas Pulsar, David Moss, who's a colleague of mine, and myself over the years, and James Beebe and a few other people. Ross Colebrook has had a good analysis of the data. There's other people that have introduced newer studies. There's the Collier-Sproul relativism scale. What you'll find is as the methods have improved, the anti-realist rates have increased. So you look at stuff like the Pulsar and Wright 2020 paper, Anti-Realist Pluralism, and they found about a consistent 75% majority of people favoring anti-realism across 7 different measures. And that's after doing their best to correct for as many methodological shortcomings for the earlier papers as possible. And you have Taylor Davis's paper where the modal response, the most common response, was a non-cognitivist response. You have James Beebe's response where he pointed out earlier studies didn't include a non-cognitivist option. He found that when it was included, it was frequently chosen. So as methods have improved, you get more and more and more anti-realist responses. I'm not speaking in hypothetical terms. I'm speaking in actual historical terms. We have studies, and the studies have really high anti-realist rates. We already have them. We already have them. So he's saying, well, if you need a peer-reviewed study for that, go out and do it. We already did. So what's the response to that? So I spent years responding to that. What is the response from realists? Why aren't they responding to it? Why aren't they engaging it? Why aren't they engaging with what I said about it? Why aren't they engaging with what Davis said about it, or Pulsar, or Wright, or Zylstra? I don't know how to say his name. I'm very sorry. Or any of the other people that David Moss, Ross Colebrook. There's a lot of people that have commented. Florian Kova. There's plenty of people, and he's done some cool work on improving methods in these studies. There are plenty of people that have been working on this for years now. We have over 20 years of this research. The earliest paper was Nichols and Folds Bennett from 2003. And that was a developmental study testing response dependence in children. So we've had at 23 years of this research, 23 years for philosophers. And this preceded, for instance, a massive literature that blew up, which started with Sharon Street, who's amazing, with her Darwinian dilemma paper. That literature, moral realists had no problem responding to that. And that paper came out later, right? When did that come out? Let's look it up. A Darwinian dilemma. I'm going to say 2008. 2006. Dang, I got it wrong. Okay, I was close though. Okay, so that came out in 2006. Realists had no problem responding to that. We've now had 23 years of empirical research. There's actually a little bit of research that goes back earlier than that. And you might want to count Kohlberg stuff. It's a little sketchy. You also have the Forsyth Ethics Position Questionnaire. I don't think that's a good operationalization. I don't even think it's trying to really measure the same thing. So never mind this earlier stuff. It really starts around 2003. They've had 23 years of this empirical literature out there. And if you want to be generous, okay, then we'll go back to 2008 and they've had 18 years. Is that 18 years? Can I do math? Yeah, I think. Holy crap. That's just the number that bubbled up from my unconscious. So they've had nearly 2 decades, possibly much more than that, right? 2 decades, almost 3 decades to learn about and respond to this literature. And I've almost never seen any realist be even aware of it, much less engage with it or respond to it. And that reflects, I think that's good evidence that realists are somewhat negligent in their epistemic responsibility to properly engage with this sort of literature. I don't know. What do you think as the audience? And let me have a look at the poll where we're at with that. Let's end the poll. How would you respond to the question? Let's see it come up. It's wrong to stab someone for interrupting you. So 61% of you said yes, and you're an anti-realist. 33% said yes, and I'm a realist. 6% said no, I'm an anti-realist, and 0% said no, and I'm a realist. Which thank you for that last one. So notice here that of the 67% of people that responded as anti-realists, 61% of you chose the yes, that it's wrong response. So this is a pretty big problem for posing the question, it's wrong to stab people for interrupting you, because anti-realists are inclined to say yes to this. So that sort of question would not be diagnostic of whether people are realists or not, on the supposition that people might not be realists. But if we're supposing they are realists, then the question is useless for determining whether people are realists or not. You can't, for instance, say, hey, assume everybody's a realist. Well, if you went out, you wouldn't need to bother asking people this question about whether it's wrong to stab people for interrupting you, because most of them are going to say yes. So that's evidence they're realists. No, you already assume they're realists, right? So on the assumption that they might not be realists, now you need to think more carefully about whether asking people, is it wrong to stab people just for interrupting you, would be an appropriate way to figure out whether they're realists. And the answer is probably not, because there's a good reason for an anti-realist to say, yes, it's wrong. If you're just imagine, for instance, that the population is full of relativists and constructivists and emotivists, like neo-expressivists, that sort of thing. What are they going to say in response to that question? They're going to say yes. Very, very few of those people are going to say no. And again, I've already repeated myself several times on that. There's something very warped about their framing of this. Well, I finished the whole drink. It's really hot here and I'm sweaty, and every time my forearm is on the table, it comes away with like a greasy spot. It's pretty gross. We got more people congratulating me. Congrats on 3,000 lands. Thank you very much. Coffee mug Smug says, I love that name and I love that profile picture. Fuck it, let's pull up the study now. My new favorite Lance quote. Thank you. Shingsai says, peer review happens after the research is done. If he's talking about oversight of research procedures, that's not peer review. Yeah, I'm certainly in favor of oversight of research procedures. And I'm also in favor of oversight once research is conducted. I'm against mandatory pre-publication peer review as administered through the journal system that is currently in operation without significant reform. That is my current position. I don't know if we need to, for instance, pay people to do reviews or have a better way of facilitating reviews, or at the very least, I really dislike the peer review being administered by journals that then throw the papers behind paywalls in a way where universities then access to those journals is then effectively inaccessible to anybody that doesn't have university access or just accesses it illegally, because the fees for accessing individual papers like $35-40 is unreasonable. I think that especially when research is taxpayer funded, so taxpayers pay to have research conducted, then that research is published in a journal that then hides it behind a paywall that nobody can access unless they have university access. This limits access to people from low-income societies or communities that potentially would want to do research but lack access unless they want to circumvent the law. And limiting, I mean, the whole point of us taxpayer-funded research is to benefit humanity. Hiding it behind a paywall and then allowing private corporations to monetize access to it and limit it to university access. No, I'm not in favor of that. But I also dislike the lack of transparency. The reviews associated with an article are rarely made public. There hasn't been adequate methods to ensure that peer reviewers aren't using AI to review papers. I think that many of them are. Many of them admit that they are. I do not use AI to review papers. I think that's total bullshit. I review the paper with my eyeballs and my stupid brain. For all that, I'm sure AI could even have some insights, but I don't use it. There may come a point where it becomes a standard procedure to have AI look at things, but for people to do it, pass it off as their own work, people are doing that. Okay. Cattle Rancher says, I'm honestly not sure to answer now that you've explained the issue. Fair enough. Cattle Rancher also asks, what about the fact that they're willing to punish wrongdoing? Does that point into realism, especially given the value of place on tolerance in society? No, not at all. I'm an anti-realist. I'm totally in favor of punishing people for committing crimes. Like if a person murders somebody, the person should be punished. They should be put in prison. I mean, personally, ideally, if we could reform a person and get them to recognize what they did is wrong, but also part of the criminal justice system isn't just reform, it's deterrence. Given the flawed nature of human beings, unfortunately, deterrence is one of the few incentives that we can have for people that would act in antisocial ways, because trying to convince them to be good clearly is not surefire. Otherwise, we would just teach everybody to be good and there wouldn't be any crime. So punishment is kind of an unfortunate necessity for a functioning society, both legally and through social means. But of course, that doesn't mean I'm in favor of any particular punishments or social or legal or otherwise. But it's like you kind of got to have it. But I think that for practical reasons, as an anti-realist, it's better for society for us to, be able to deter people from committing crimes. That, of course, doesn't mean I endorse any particular criminal justice system. The amount of flaws and problems you could identify in the U.S. criminal justice system or other criminal justice systems, I don't want to get too political here, but it's just this should be a nonpartisan issue. It's just titanic to a level that is outrageous beyond description. So, and I think everybody should agree with that. If you're like super right wing, you should be really, or like, again, it's not a political issue. When there's incompetent police work, everybody should be opposed to that. Or when there's injustices in the way people are treated in prisons, everybody should be opposed. Like, is that even a question? And the fact that so little is done about it, I think, is really kind of tragic. Anyway. More congrats on the 3K. Thank you very much. This is more stuff about the paywalls. Yeah, so Rachel Majir says the correct conclusion to draw from the literature around folk anti-realism is that there's not a folk answer to this because they don't even think about it. So Rachel, have you read any of my dissertation on this or my interviews or my discussions about this? And was your view formed on the basis of that, or did you form this independently? Because this is my view. So I'll say a little bit about that. My dissertation is called Schrodinger's Categories. So my friend Sam Rosen, shout out to Sam, who recently got married. So congrats to Sam. And he's super happy. And he keeps sending me these amazing pictures where he's traveling. I'm not going to say where he is or all that stuff because I don't know how private he is. He's pretty public about stuff, but whatever. Anyway, Sam, shout out to you. So Sam came up with that idea, Schrodinger's Categories. Now, I have sometimes not noticed obvious things. In case it's not obvious, Schrodinger's cat, Schrodinger's categories. That's the joke. So Sam came up with that. Give him the credit for that title. And then the subtitle is The Indeterminacy of Folk Metaethics, I think. But I can't even remember the subtitle of my own paper. Offhand. So what I argue in that paper is that existing measures of folk metaethics are largely invalid. I do think some are better than others. I typically say the Pulzer and Wright paper is the best paper on the topic. I just published a critique of that too. So I critique even the best, but that paper is just awesome. And Pulzer and Wright have done such really cool, groundbreaking work. So there's a paper back from 2013, Wright, Grandjean, and McWhite, where they tried to address some potential problems and limitations with the Goodwin and Darley 2008 study. That's a really cool paper. Again, it has problems with it, and I've critiqued it, but it's a great paper. And Wright and her colleagues are really pushing the envelope with that and advancing things, and I really like that. But Pulzer and has done some collaborations with Wright and then some self-published papers. Really outlined a lot of the methodological problems with this research before I was able to publish or write about it. Now, I have done my exams to proceed to the dissertation phase on addressing those questions. So I could show like, hey, here's a Google Docs showing I came up with some of these criticisms. But Pulzer was the first to publish some of them, and he published ones that hadn't occurred to me. So double credit to Pulzer for beating me to the punch and doing stuff, and also doing some stuff just better than me. So Pulzer has really advanced the field probably the most. And I hope David Moss and I, we have our early paper. We have some other stuff on the way. I've done a little bit of stuff on my own as well, like my recent critique of Pulzer and Wright. And so David Moss he pushed stuff with promoting qualitative research, and he conducted some interviews, and that was really cool. And that showed a lot of the internal inconsistency and uncertainty that people have. And then I gathered a whole bunch of data, and then I also gathered open response data from other people. But I gathered a ton of open response data from people and looked at how they interpret questions. So my research was kind of meta research. My dissertation centered on arguing, okay, here on theoretical grounds or methodological problems of the existing literature, to where we should be very skeptical that it's providing us valid measures of what people think. Then what I did is the empirical wing of it was to look at this meta research. How are people interpreting questions about metaethics? Are they interpreting them as researchers intended? And the answer is, for the most part, probably not. They do not appear to interpret the questions as intended. Now, there's a couple explanations for that would be the main candidates. One is the way the studies are designed they're misoperationalized. They're not operationalized in a way where people are able to understand them. It's possible if they ask the questions in a clearer or better way, then you could appropriately elicit a valid metaethical position. That's one possibility. And it is supported by the messy literature that we have. But there is another possibility, and it's the one I favor and try to argue for against some of this sort of initial sort of superficial weight in favor of the other hypothesis. And this hypothesis is the much harder one to prove, which is that there's nothing to measure. They're not realists or anti-realists. And it's just not part of folk concepts or folk language to decisively take a stance on the realism, anti-realism issue. And to show that can also explain, why do people give such weird, inconsistent, seemingly incoherent responses? Well, if you ask people a bunch of questions trying to figure out, do they take position A or position B, and they don't take a position, you're going to get some kind of response. And so I also have studies showing how forced choice questionnaires, in other words, questions that force you to pick A or B, can give the illusion of patterns of genuine belief among people, even when they're not present. You can just imagine a study where you force people to answer, do you believe in shoobaloo or wappa wappa booba, A or B? And there's like, you're literally clicking on a survey on an online form, and your options are shoobaloo blue or wabba dabba diba or whatever the hell he said. Right, I don't know what he said. It's one of the two. I could give those to people. In fact, let's do it here. We're going to do a poll. And I'm not going to give you neither of those because that's fucking nonsense. So which do you endorse? Shuba Luba Boo. Shuba Luba Boo. I have a personal prediction about which one will be favored. And Wappa Dappa Doodah. Okay. Let's start the poll. Everybody, please answer this. This is the most important poll I've ever run on my channel, and it's critical that you respond to this immediately. Everybody respond. All right, we'll take a few minutes on that. Spiritual Eurasianist says, yeah, I think you made your point well. I hope you're responding to me. Yeah, I made my point well. I hope so. The digital says the U.S. justice system is perfect. That is obvious sarcasm. So you have a lot of sarcasm coming at you. Maybe we can't assume moral realism to be the common sense position. Yeah, we should not assume it to be. And you know what? It could be. I just think that the current preponderance of evidence suggests that it's probably not. Synthwave says, yeah, one does need some sort of negative effect punishment to commit crimes. The punishment does not need to be retributive or carceral in nature. Yeah. So, and by the way, Greg Caruso, who's a free will skeptic and favors like criminal justice reform against he thinks we should not punish people for retributive reasons. He has this like quarantine model. He's agreed to go on the channel, but he's going to be here a couple months from now. I think he has a book coming out, which probably I'll grab the book and have a look at that and do more free will content, especially because I'm working on a free will project now. So you're going to get more free will content on the channel. And I've been reading more free will stuff. So, hey, everybody, I'm currently working on free will, not meta ethics. Although, I was working on a meta ethics project this morning, so that's not true. Okay. But yeah, so this would be the point. It doesn't have to be done this particular way. Now, you know what? I'm not going to get too much more into that. We'll talk to Greg and see what he has to say. All right. Do studies find any, this is from Jeremy Gord. Do studies find any significant number of responses along the lines of there's no response? There's no one response that I have. Different parts of me seem to have conflicting feelings at the same time. That is an excellent question. So when David Moss interviewed people did seem to give equivocal responses and to be uncertain and to vacillate between the positions. I can also report, of course, without giving specifics, that one of the assignments I give to my students is to interview friends or family members about their views about moral relativism. Like, do they endorse it or reject it? And often what you'll get from people are seemingly internally inconsistent responses. Now, moral realists are not unaware of this. So if you read the beginning of Mike Humer's Ethical Intuitionism, right at the beginning of the book, he talks about how, you know, if you start to talk to students, you'll get almost unanimous support for moral relativism. But if you press them, you'll often get remarks that appear inconsistent with the relativism, but they'll still insist on the relativism. And you could go back and forth, and it's like whack-a-mole, right? Is it relativism here, not relativism? Relativism here, not relativism. That is my experience. I think we're having the same experience where, and he explicitly says it looks like the typical, at least public explicit view is a kind of incoherent view. Now, Humer goes on to say, if I recall, that he thinks a lot of this is performative and that actually the people are implicit realists. Now, I do think a lot of what people publicly say about moral issues inside and outside of the classroom is performative. I think I say performative stuff. I think you probably say performative stuff. I think a big part of morality and moral speech is performative. So I agree with that component. But what I don't agree with is that really they're implicit realists. I think they're implicit none of the above. And I just don't think there's good evidence that they're realists. But this particular one, are there studies specifically looking at ambivalence? Not to my knowledge. And that's something, let me take a note of that, because that's something worth checking into. And that's something worth testing. And it could be that there is, and I don't remember it offhand. All right, I'm gonna label that, Jeremy. I'm gonna label that meta-ethical ambivalence, and I'm gonna dig around to find out if anybody's done a study on that. I think the answer is no. But I do think other people besides myself would be interested in that question. By the way, if you do research in experimental meta-ethics and you want to run a study on meta-ethical ambivalence, feel free. I don't claim to own this idea. You can see right here, Jeremy Gord asked about it. And I'll also give an acknowledgement to Jeremy if Jeremy wants an acknowledgement. If anybody runs a study on that, publishes a paper. Okay, that's a great question. The answer is I don't know. Raceland, so this is the person that said that you basically said, people don't have views on this, right? And this, so sorry, to go back to the dissertation, what I argue is, and I think I already said this, I argue for what's called folk meta-ethical indeterminacy. It's the view that non-philosophers are neither realist nor anti-realist. They just don't have a view on this. I've given this analogy many times, but it comes from Michael Gill's paper, Indeterminacy and Variability of Meta-ethics. He was the one that originally proposed the possibility of meta-ethical indeterminacy. And my paper, I explicitly say, is a kind of empirical expansion on that project. Now, Gill makes the point that when people talk about, just take everyday people talk about mathematics. Like someone says, oh, that's 5 hours from now, or your bill will be $17.22 or whatever. People talk about use mathematical language all the time. Do they have to, and do they in fact have an implicit position on mathematical Platonism? No. Probably not. And so you could see how that's a clear case where, and again, notice we haven't run a study on this. I'm not aware of any studies on this, but I agree with Eric Sampson about this. I don't think we need to run a study on that to think it's probably the case that it's not the case that ordinary people take a position on mathematical Platonism, yay or nay. And so I just say, look, if that could be true in that case, I think it could also be true in the metaethical case. I think it is true. Oh, right. Severe says, Lance, you forgot to tell us how we have reason to answer the poll question, independent of whether or not we have reasons to. Jeremy asks, how often do non-academics say something closer to, I don't know which way I think versus part of me thinks both ways? That's also an excellent question. Yeah. How often do people just say, I don't know versus I'm in, like literally ambivalent? There is some discussion of ambivalence in research on the ship of Theseus. There's a small literature on that. And I also discuss that with my students. And it requires a specific type of operationalization to capture ambivalence. What you don't want to do is capture some people say A and some people say B. What you want to do is capture people saying both A and B. I think Josh Knobe, let me make a note of this. I think Josh Knobe has work on ambivalence. What is that stupid? Give me 1 second. Elicit. I'm going to throw this into Elicit and ask it for research on this. Person. Okay, so I'll throw that in there, and then I'm going to pop over to Google Scholar and check that as well. So Elicit is like an AI research aggregator thing. Okay, so we got a paper from 2016, Ambivalence of Philosophical Exploration. Okay. We've got a Josh Knobe paper from this year, Conflicting Intuitions. Let's see, I'm going to read the abstract. Research, in fact, let me throw a link in here to the chat. Research on intuitions about philosophical thought experiments shows striking pattern. Often, there are powerful intuitions on one side and also powerful intuitions on the exact opposite side. Bingo, this is what we're looking for. A question now, see, I didn't even need to list it. I just remember Josh Knobe said stuff about this. All right, a question now arises about how to understand this pattern. One possible view would be that it's primarily a matter of different people having different intuitions. I present evidence for the view that this is not the correct understanding. Instead, I suggest it is primarily a matter of individual people having conflicting intuitions. That is, it is primarily a matter of individual people having an intuition on one side and also having an intuition on the opposite side. I love the very formal, precise clarity of the way Josh Knobe writes. I've always really liked his writing. This looks cool. Boom. Thank you, Jeremy, for bringing that up, and I will look into it. So we do have a paper on this. Very cool. And I'm sure there's more. This is just the first thing that popped up in Google Scholar. Actually, it is the first thing. Okay. All right, so we've got that. Give me another second. What was that journal? 1 second. I just need to check something. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so I will check that later. 1 moment. Yeah. And there might be another paper to talk about the next time I do a stream. If I could find it really quick. See if I can find it. Yeah. In the middle of a stream. Where is that? Nope, nope, nope. It's not that. It's not that. I'll have to find it later. I'll have to find it later. Oh well. Okay. So what do we want to do? We were reviewing a video. Why don't we? This is people in the chat, so I'm going to keep going with that. Oh, right. Another thing to check. So everybody, I predicted Wapadapa would win, and I think it only won by a small margin. I predicted it would win by a larger margin. So we have about an even Wapadapa and Shubalubaloo. So the point here is that obviously none of you actually endorse either of those positions, but if you present participants at the study design that forces them to pick one, they're all going to pick one. And I illustrate this with a study in my paper that studies always give the appearance of determinacy because they determinately require people to answer in one way or another. So this is a problem. It's very hard to get direct evidence of indeterminacy. All right, let's have a look at what else people say. Okay. Okay, let's keep going with the video, but I actually have to bring the video back up. Nope, not that. And while I'm at it, I am going to need a bathroom break, everybody. So I will be back in a couple minutes. So everybody talk to each other in the chat or something. I don't know. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Let's keep going.
Reason do you have to think that no, actually there's most people out there or think that if somebody interrupts you, it's perfectly fine for you just to stab them. I don't think I've ever met anybody like that. I don't think
Yeah, the framing definitely sounds like he's talking about normative stuff and not just metaethical stuff. And as we've discussed at length now, that's not an accurate representation of what I think.
People, I think most people would be appalled and they'd just be like, what the hell is wrong with you? Why are you stabbing somebody? Because, most of us assume that we're all on board with this, that, seems pretty clear that you shouldn't stab somebody just for interrupting you and torture babies, throw people off buildings, just to see them splat and, take any sort of like, morally, outrageous kind of thing. Yeah, I guess if the anti-realist move is to say, actually, people don't believe that kind of thing, I guess I think, that's you could go that way if you want, but I guess I find that I don't know. I'll ask you, Gage. Like, I don't know. Do you think most people, when they consider this this proposition, hey, if somebody interrupts you, you shouldn't stab them? Do you think do you think that like people out there, they're just sort of like unclear about this? There's like maybe 50-50 among the population. I guess like, what do you think about that?
No, I agree that I think there's a pretty strong presumption in favor of the Folkmorian stuff.
Notice right there, and this is where I'd stop. He says there's a favor and there's, let's get the exact wording.
Maybe 50-50 among the population. I guess like, what do you think about that?
No, I agree that I think there's a pretty strong presumption in favor of the Folkmorian stuff.
The Folkmorian stuff. Now, Moore was a non-naturalist moral realist. Are they saying that the folk view is a non-naturalist realist position on the wrongness of stabbing people just for interrupting you? If so, are they saying that the folk view is a specific meta-ethical view along with the normative view, or are they saying it's just the normative view without the meta-ethical view? Because if it's just the normative view, why would you bring up why would you say Morean? If it is the Morean view, why aren't they being clear about this being both a meta-ethical view and a normative view? Notice how the total lack of clarity here. It's really, really frustrating. Are you saying that the ordinary typical view among people is specifically Morean's view? G.E. Moore's view? Or are you saying it's some normative claim? What the heck are you saying? I can repeat this point 50 times, but it's just that they keep repeating things in an unclear way and they're not clarifying. Notice how I've been here an hour and a half. I've spent a considerable portion of the time thinking aloud, trying to articulate, and in some cases, maybe even repetitively to a considerable extent, re-articulate things to try to be clear. Isn't the point to be clear? And yet they're not clear. And I just find that so frustrating because I'm the critic of analytic philosophy and I'm trying my best to be clear. And I'm criticizing people doing analytic philosophy for not being clear. Isn't analytic philosophy supposed to be about clarity? And they're just not. And they're not in a way that ends up mattering. This isn't like a trivial lack of clarity. Rayson asks, Lance, when you say you're researching free will, do you mean compatibilism, incompatibilism, or determinism? Neither of them, actually. I'm not doing research on either of those. Okay, I don't know what that person's talking about. Sorry, Laborious. I don't know what that's about. Maybe that's part of a context I'm not part of.
Although I will say, to play a little bit of the devil's advocate or go on the anti-realist side for a second, that when the researchers try to do stuff like this, I guess it's pretty hard to survey the folk because there are a bunch of ways you can interpret these kind of questions. So like if you're trying to explain stance independence to a layperson, the worry there could be, well, maybe after this, after I've explained some of these terms, they're no longer folk, right? They have some...
Well, there's almost no chance they're not getting that exact point from me. So if they're getting their points from me, why are they getting the other? Why are they not clear about the other stuff?
Relevant training that would disqualify them or kind of sway their... So there's been a lot.
So this is a point explicitly from my most recent published paper, which is, can I remember the title of that one? Why training paradigms won't save experimental metaethics. Yeah, I got it. Okay, so that's the point I make in that paper. So this point is from my work. Which is fine for them to present it here. But the point here is just that the point of that is that I'm arguing that we're not able to measure whether the folk are realists or not. The entire framing that they've used for the first 5 minutes of this video is in terms of, do people think it's wrong to stab people just for interrupting them? What the hell? My position is that they don't think it's stance independently wrong. And that's never been made explicit here. Jesus.
Of methodological pushback on some of the studies that are purported, I believe, to show that there are a significant amount of realists among us in the population for stuff like this. So I think they would just try to argue the underdetermination, the bad methodology, and then just be like, well, then they would probably say that's maybe sufficient to refute the claim that there is actually this kind of overwhelming consensus on this judgment.
So when I say most people think that you shouldn't stab somebody for interrupting you or, torture babies or whatever, I'm not claiming that people think it stance independently wrong to do that.
There we go. So why did it take him 5 minutes to be clear about that? And if he doesn't think that, then what the fuck is the disagreement? What does he think people think then?
What I'm claiming is that people think that you shouldn't do that. And now we have to do some philosophy and ask like, okay, well, what makes it the case that you shouldn't do that? Well, all I'm claiming.
See, so they did go for the third option. So you got 3 options here. The ordinary person thinks it stands independently wrong or not, like they think it stands independently right or wrong. The ordinary person thinks it stands dependently right or wrong, or thinks it's right or wrong in some other determinate sense, like they're an expressivist or whatever. Then you have a third option, which is you first figure out whether they think it's right or wrong. Then you figure out what is it that makes it wrong. Okay, so what is it that makes it wrong? Are you then asking a metaphysical question? Is the metaphysical question presupposing the semantics? Because the metaphysical question about what makes it wrong is separate from the semantic question of what the person means. So when we say that the person thinks it's wrong. What is it that the person thinks? Does the person think it stands independently wrong? Do they think it stands dependently wrong? Or do they think it's wrong in some other sense? And if it's in some other sense, what sense is that? Are you saying something like they oppose it? They're against it? We need to be clear. I'm not saying it can't be the third option because, again, keep in mind, my position is that it is the third option, right? I don't think people think it stands dependent or stands independent. I think something like when a person is asked that kind of question, in a lot of contexts, they're responding with something, it's probably not something very clear or coherent, but it's something like, I am against it. I don't want people to do it. I wouldn't want people to do it under a bunch of counterfactual and hypothetical circumstances, maybe. So they might be expressing attitudes. They might be taking practical positions on things. What I don't think that they're doing is answering in a way that is then amenable to subsequent analysis that you could then determine what their semantics of what they're saying is after you've secured agreement. You can't have it both ways. At least I don't think that you can. Either they mean something that fits with realism or anti-realism, or they don't. If they don't, you're not going to be able to first secure their agreement, then determine that they're implicitly a realist or anti-realist. No, that's not how that works. Either they're implicitly a realist, they're implicitly an anti-realist, or they're neither implicitly a realist nor an anti-realist. One of the three. And so if we're going with they're not implicitly realist or anti-realist, that's the end of the discussion. The person is not a realist or anti-realist. If you then want to ask a meta-ethical question, which is the person thinks that it's wrong, or the person has some whatever normative moral view, and you then want to ask a metaphysical question about what is it that makes things right or wrong, that's fine. But now you're not doing empirical work on what that person thinks. You're not asking a separate question independent of what that person thinks. So let's say the person thinks it's wrong, and then what it is that makes things wrong is, like, I don't know, some objective moral properties or something like that. That's a separate question from what the person themselves is committed to or means. So we need to keep these questions separate. When I say an ordinary person does not think it stands independently wrong to do something, all I'm saying is that the person is not a realist. They're not committed to realism. They're not endorsing realism. That's it. I'm not saying anything about their normative or first order moral attitudes. So if what Eric is clarifying here is that he's only talking about their first order standards, why was it attributed to me that I think that it's not the case, or that the empirical studies are centered on the normative question? I don't think that, and that's never been what I'm talking about. And so the person interviewing him apparently is familiar with my work, but somehow posed a question about first order questions. Like, do most people think it's wrong? That's a first order question. My claim is that they're not realists, not that they don't have any particular first order position. So it just looks like the inconsistencies in their construal of what my position is. So it doesn't make any sense.
I mean, the more in premise is just this. It's not it doesn't build in the realism to it. Just like most people think that it's wrong to stab people. My guess.
And what does that mean?
Is that most people haven't reflected very much on, like, well, what explains it? Is it like, stands independently wrong that they should do this? Does it depend on somebody's attitudes? Is this merely?
So you notice this weird two-step, right? First, they determine it's right or wrong. Then they determine whether or not it's right or wrong in the realist sense. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What is it that the person means when they think that it's wrong, right? So let's say it turns out that when a person responds to the question, is it wrong to stab a person just for interrupting you? And they say yes, what they're committed to is they don't like it. Okay, so now you determine what is it that makes it true that they don't like it. Well, the realist answer is never going to make sense of that, right? Only an anti-realist view makes sense of that, because the position is just a position about what the person thinks. I guess you could be a realist, like technically subjectively true that they think that, but what you're not going to get are stance-independent moral properties making it the case that it's irreducibly normative that one has reasons where they ought not stab people just for interrupting them. See, I really lower the lingo down. So the point is that if that's all the person is committed to, you're never going to be able to get a realist or anti-realist reading out of that independent. You just have this descriptive fact. The person doesn't like it, or the person doesn't want people to do it. And so it's important to hammer out what exactly the person is agreeing to when they say, yes, they think it's wrong to stab people for interrupting you. What doesn't make sense is to say, yes, they think the proposition is true in a way that's like a stem cell, they agree, then we figure out whether it's realism or anti-realism. What the hell? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I just don't think that makes sense. What is it that they're agreeing to prior to the realist or anti-realist analysis? What is it? Now, again, I'm not saying it has to be one of the two. I'm saying if it's not one of the two, if it's some third thing, then that third thing may not be amenable to one or the other or either of the realist or anti-realist analyses, right? So again, let's say they say, you ask a person, do you think it's wrong to stab people for interrupting you? And they say yes. And we figure out what the person is committed to. And what they're committed to is some sort of social contract idea. Like they're committed to this idea that we live in a society, and in virtue of we all mutually agree to uphold certain sorts of rules, blah, 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 blah. Now, if that's what they agree to, now I think the best reading would be some kind of constructivist reading. And so the person might be implicitly committed to some type of anti-realism. The point would just be, once you unpack what the person is committed to, that is what answers your question of whether the person is a realist or anti-realist. It makes no sense to first secure the person's agreement and then figure out what is it that makes the proposition true, because there's a separate question of, is it true that things are stance independently wrong or stance dependently wrong? That's one question. And then there's a question of what the person thinks or is committed to. Those are separate questions. And it looks like they're not drawing a clear distinction between the two. So this two-step process, Enoch did the same thing. There's something very funky and underspecified about this, and there's something wrong with it. It's so weird, I'm not even sure how to assess it. Digital, maybe you have thoughts on this. Do you know what's going on here? Like why they do things in this order, in this way? And do you find something to be off about this? Because it seems weird.
An expression. I think that most people haven't thought about that question at all. The Morning Prince doesn't rely on the idea that people think it's stance independently wrong. You get to the stance independent further down the line. You start with this. Look, there are some things that seem clearly true. It seems clearly true to me that, I shouldn't, plow through pedestrians at a crosswalk. I don't claim that it stands independently wrong. When I consider that proposition, should I just plow through a bunch of pedestrians at a crosswalk? It's not as though when I'm considering that, the stance independent sort of wears itself on the experience of considering that. What is evident is that you shouldn't do it. And then
again, what does that mean? It's evident that you shouldn't do it. What does that mean? What is it that's evident, right? So there's a big difference between you shouldn't do it in a way that's irreducibly normative. So here's one thing you could mean when you say you shouldn't do it. You could mean it would be inconsistent with the set of irreducibly normative stance-independent moral facts, which are reason providing for you to perform the action. Another thing it could mean is it would be inconsistent with the standards of our culture. Another thing it could mean is it would be inconsistent with the reflective set of values you would hold were you ideally rational and internally consistent about your views. It could mean a lot of things. If it doesn't mean one of those things, what does it mean? What specifically does it mean? What is it that they're agreeing to? I don't think it makes any sense to first determine whether you agree or not, then determine what it means. Because what the hell did you agree with before you determine what you meant by what you agreed with? That doesn't make sense. That gets the order wrong. First, you get clear, what is it that that is on the table as a candidate proposition for me to agree or disagree with? Then we'll decide whether I agree or disagree with it. So, and again, there's a difference between what people think or are committed to and what they would say if you ask them a question. I fully grant that if you ask people, do you think it's wrong to stab a person for interrupting you, that the person would say yes. But notice that is a superficial overlay. That's just the language. There's a difference between what they would say and what they mean by what they say. I'm interested in what they mean by what they say. I am not at all disputing what people would say when asked. So sometimes I would dispute what people say when asked. I'm just saying I'm not necessarily disputing it. Because as we've seen, when you actually give people these sorts of questions, not this particular question, but when you give them questions like in the Pulzer and Wright study, they actually do frequently give anti-realist responses. So that's already a problem for Eric, or at least possibly a problem. I don't know what he would say about those studies. But if that's not what you're doing, and you're just posing the question, it's unclear what it is that people are supposed to agree to. There's something very strange about this. All right, let's see what Digital has to say about this. Oh, I think they do it to try and sort of account for your data. What do they do to try to account for my data? Like, they know you have some data that ordinary people don't report these kinds of commitments, and they're trying to pre-bunk your claims. So I think they're trying to be like, quote, I wouldn't expect ordinary folk to produce these reports, but they would say it's bad to stab. That's humble, isn't it? Can you say a bit more about that? No Cakewalk says, what does it mean to say it's evident that I shouldn't plow through pedestrians? Yeah, and you might think it's silly to ask what it means to do that. It's not silly, because there's a difference between the sort of semantics of this stuff, or at least a lot of philosophers would say there's a semantic question of like what the proposition is that people are agreeing to. What is the meaning of the proposition? And then there's all this pragmatic stuff. So, for instance, if you said, yeah, it would be fine for me to plow through pedestrians, or it wouldn't be wrong for me to plow through pedestrians. While there might be propositional content there is also, in almost any real world context, pragmatic implicatures. There's all this pragmatics associated with what you're saying. You're conveying, for instance, a lack of you're expressing a potential willingness to perform the action. That's not conveyed by the proposition it stands independently wrong, or it's not stands independently wrong to plow through a group of pedestrians. That's not entailed by either of those. But if a person were to say it's not wrong to do this thing, it's not wrong to commit fraud. Is it more likely for that person to commit fraud? Probably. Is that person less likely to oppose other people committing fraud? Probably. So it carries pragmatic implications about what the person is committed to that are not part of the propositional content of whatever semantic analysis that you give. And so if we're talking about ordinary language only can and does occur in ordinary contexts. Otherwise, it wouldn't be ordinary language. This is a matter of definition, right? And so in ordinary contexts, there is almost always, it would practically by definition, some social matter of consideration. And so pragmatic considerations are almost always part of the meaning of what's being conveyed by the person. And we cannot properly assess what people are doing or meaning or thinking or committed to in ordinary language without considering all of those pragmatic considerations, because that's part of the meaning of what they're doing. And so when a person says something like, it's not wrong to stab people just for interrupting you, they're not making a purely abstract theoretical claim that has no bearing on their attitudes or their disposition to act, at least in almost any actual real world ordinary context. In those ordinary contexts, the motivation for a person to say that would be partially contingent on the context in which the person is. I actually think it would be fully contingent on it. So that it would make any sense to try to figure out what people would mean in response to these sorts of questions without considering the social context in which the person is saying the thing in question. And once you're considering that, and once it's in that social context, there are always invariably social considerations and stakes in play that fix the pragmatic features of what the person is trying to convey. And those cannot be eliminated from ordinary language. They constitute what makes it ordinary language. Ordinary language is not abstracted from any particular context. It is, by definition, what occurs in real world context. That's what it is. So you cannot eliminate the pragmatics. Now, someone could try to say, well, what are the semantic commitments, all of these people that generalize across these cases? I don't think the question makes sense. That's like saying, what is the motivation for walking? Doesn't make sense. Everybody has a different motivation. Like the only way to examine the motivation for walking is to look at individual cases. Now, you could talk about statistical regularities, and you can make very general claims. You could say the typical motivation for walking is to arrive at places. Not always. Some people walk on a treadmill. They're not trying to arrive anywhere. In fact, they're very much trying to not go anywhere. They're actually walking to exercise, or maybe they're walking on there in order to superficially give the appearance that they're exercising. But actually, they're walking at a really slow rate, and they're just on TikTok or something. To convince themselves that they're exercising. There's lots of reasons a person could walk. But the point would just be, it doesn't make any sense to say, what is the motivation for walking? What's the universal motivation? There isn't one. Likewise, to ask, what is the propositional content of your typical ordinary moral claim might just be a nonsense question. There might be statistical regularities, but those statistical regularities won't be abstractable and extractable from all the context so that you could say something universal about all the cases. Now, to the extent that there is something universal to say about these cases, I think it's going to be some sort of sociological factor, and there may not be any perfect universal thing. There may be edge cases and boundary cases where we have fuzzy boundaries, but between what counts as a moral statement or judgment and what doesn't. That's what I suspect. And I don't think that you're going to find these semantic universals in terms of what people mean by a moral claim. You could always go top down and say, by moral claims I'm stipulating, I mean judgments that meet these conditions. But then that's not a bottom up way of extracting the meaning from ordinary language. Now you're stipulating things and then seeing what comports with it. That's not a proper way of extracting sort of natural kinds out of the language. So if you're extracting this out of the language, you're now going to have to ask questions about the pragmatic considerations of what people are doing with the language. And that, if you think about that, is that something that it would be easy to do from the armchair? Absolutely not. Not only is it going to be hard to do, I don't even think you could do it with surveys. Like the standard experimental philosophy methods, I've argued they're inadequate. So in order to get a proper handle on how moral language is used, I'm not simply calling for peer-reviewed studies. I'm not simply calling for surveys. I'm calling for, and what I think would be necessary to pin this down, is a massive interdisciplinary, probably decades-long project that would draw on anthropology, comparative linguistics, cognitive psychology, social psychology, sociology, history. You need to do archival analyses. You need to do neuroscientific research. What you would need is mutually corroborating data from a number of different fields employing different methods and paradigms that converge on a richer and more complicated, more accurate picture of how the language is functioning and what the language is doing in the context in which it actually occurs. That is going to require hundreds, if not thousands, of researchers over an extended period of time. I don't think anybody's really that motivated to do that kind of social scientific research. I don't think they're going to do it. And so I think these questions will remain largely unanswered. What I don't think is that realists are entitled to presume to know the answers to these questions, or to be as ambiguous and unclear about what the questions even are, much less what the answers are. I mean, they're giving answers to questions and they're not even clear on what the questions are. This is a problem, and this is a pretty big problem.
So we haven't got to realism yet. We just got to, yeah, that seems like something you shouldn't do. Now the question is, why shouldn't you do it? And then now we're asking, like, does it depend on someone's stance? And here's where you get to the realism. You start with, look, most people think it's wrong to do that. They probably have absolutely no idea why. They haven't thought about it. They don't care about it. But now once we do a little philosophy and then we begin to ask, okay, so it seems clear to me that it is wrong to plow through pedestrians. Now, why is it? So
again, before you answer the question, why is it wrong? Don't you first need to know what it means for it to be wrong? And doesn't that already presuppose some particular, like once you're in the philosophical mode of reflection and you start thinking, oh, okay, so I responded yes. What do I take that to mean? And now you have to first unpack what it means. Then you ask the question of whether it's true or false. You don't first determine it's true or false, then figure out what you mean. That's nonsense. This is nonsense.
It depends on someone's stance. Whose stance would it depend on? Would it depend on my stance? Like, is it wrong to plow through pedestrians at a crosswalk because I don't like that? Or I disapprove of it or something like that? It seems to me, no. I mean, even if...
So what is it that seems to you? So we agree it's wrong to plow through crowded pedestrians. Now we consider, is its wrongness dependent on my stance? And then now it seems no. What is it that seems no? It seems no that its wrongness is dependent. So what the hell is the wrongness, right? So if what it would mean for it to be wrong is that it would be stance independently wrong, obviously it doesn't depend on your stance. But if what it means for it to be wrong is that you don't approve of it, does that depend on your stance? Yes. So why is he doing this backwards, where first you determine your conclusion, then you figure out how you arrive at the conclusion, right? Because if you first go, yes, it's wrong to drive through a crowd of pedestrians, then you go, is its wrongness dependent on my stance? No. Okay, well, now you've discovered that what you meant by wrong is something that isn't dependent on your stance. So what you agreed to when you said it was wrong is it stands independently wrong. So that is what you were committed to. And so he is asking, do you think it stands independently wrong? Or at least that's an entailment of it. Or at least that's what you're discovering about the person. You're discovering that the person thought it was stance independently wrong. But my answer to that is, yes, it does depend on my stance. And it trivially depends on my stance because when I initially said yes, what I meant was I don't approve of it. And whether I approve of things or not does depend on my stance. It's constituted by my stance. Problem solved. Apparently, my answer is an anti-realist answer. How do we generalize from that? We fucking don't. If you wanted to find out what other people think, you need to do studies, or they need to go study philosophy and figure things out, and then you ask them. But what you don't do is go, well, first I agree that it's wrong. Then I ask myself, does its wrongness depend on my stance? I find I have the intuition no, and so I go, I can rule out subjectivism. Great. So you've discovered you personally don't have a subjectivist intuition. Wow. That is not very informative about how anybody else thinks or what they mean. Why would that generalize? Why would it generalize? Again, we have empirical data on this, and there's no good evidence that how analytic philosophers happen to think about these issues generalizes to how the freaking American public thinks about them. Much less do we have any data that it generalizes to other people. But notice, there's a big, big, big difference between whether a person would say yes or no to that first question. Just would they say yes or no to, is it wrong to stab people just for interrupting you? My answer to that is most people would say yes to that question. Yes, it's wrong. Now, do I then think most people would give the realist response? No, I don't. Not lay people. And there's no good evidence of that. And the question I'm raising is, and what I'm saying we need to study for is the second one. We don't need a study to figure out whether people would say yes or no to the first question. We need a study to figure out whether or not people do or would endorse realism under the actual conditions in the former case or the counterfactual conditions in the latter case. That's what you need empirical evidence for. That's what I'm talking about. And that's not what was addressed in the first few minutes of this video. So they have mischaracterized my position and mischaracterized what it is I'm objecting to. And now he's using the procedure that I'm also criticizing. I'm saying that particular thing of finding you personally, Eric Sampson, have this particular intuition. There's no good reason to think that that generalizes to everybody. If he does think it generalizes to everybody, where is the evidence that it generalizes to everybody? And that is no longer a common sense claim. The common sense claim at best would be if people were asked if is it wrong to stab a person just for interrupting you, that they would say yes to that, or that they would agree to the proposition, it is wrong to stab people just for fun. I agree. Never raised an issue with that. What I'm raising an issue with is whether that implies that the person's a realist or not. That's the empirical question, and that's what we don't have evidence for. So by not drawing a clear distinction between the two, I think that they're giving the impression that I have a kind of silly objection that could be easily dismissed from the armchair, and I don't.
If I approved of it, you still shouldn't do it. It seems like it doesn't depend on your attitudes. It doesn't depend on, the cultures. Like if we had a culture of a bunch of people, like suppose there's a culture on planet Earth and they all think it's perfectly fine for you to, slam into people. I guess I think that doesn't settle it. I mean, I guess I would just think, those people are wrong. When we're trying to figure out is it seems clearly true that you shouldn't, slam into these people. And now we want to, and so then we ask, why? And now we're doing meta-ethics, and now we want to know, I take it that lots of anti-realists will say, no, we agree. Hey, we're anti-realists. We think it's wrong. We just think it depends on someone's stance. And now I ask you, great, tell me the stance. Whose stance does it depend on? Does it depend on yours?
Well, whose stance it depends on who's making the claim and what it's being indexed to. It'd be the same thing for like chocolate cake is good. Whose stance does that depend on? Who's making the claim? When I say it's wrong to stop people just for fun or to plow through pedestrians, I'm referencing my own standards. They make it wrong, or they are constituted like, they don't really make it wrong in some way that's reified. And if someone else makes a different claim, that would mean it would be indexed to their standards. What's the issue?
Mine, a cultures. You tell me, and then I'll raise problems for that particular view.
Yep. Okay, great. So then we could get into those problems. But there's a separate question of whether my anti-realist position is defensible or not, or subject to objections, and a descriptive account of how ordinary people think or what they're committed to. Those are separate questions.
About, well, what stance is it that makes it wrong to do that? And I think it's going to be very difficult to identify a stance that makes it wrong to do that kind of thing. And
this is a very weird way of phrasing it. A stance that makes it wrong. Does he think that people think there's a particular stance that makes it wrong? Wrong in what sense? Because if you endorse a stance-dependent theory, you think stances make things wrong relative to the stances, however many of those that there are. There's not a stance that makes it wrong. His phrasing here is not very clear.
And the proof's in the pudding. I mean, you just give me the stance, and then we'll consider cases like, well, what if the people who the relevant stance, what if they had different attitudes? Would it be right?
Okay, so here's what I would say. When I say something is wrong, I'm telling you something about my own stance on the matter. I'm telling you about what I approve of or disapprove of. They're just basically the same thing. Now, and there's often some pragmatic stuff and some other stuff going on. And when I speak in ordinary language, there might be quite a few other things that are pragmatically carried along with what I'm saying. Now, if you were then to say, well, what exactly did he say here?
Thing. And the proof's in the pudding. I mean, you just give me the stance, and then we'll consider cases like, well, what if other people, the relevant stance?
Yeah. So I'll give you the stance. The stance is my stance. Now, what if other people held a contrary stance? Okay, I don't care. So consider, we'll compare it to food. So I like strawberry ice cream. What if other people don't like strawberry ice cream? Irrelevant. I still like it. What if I didn't like strawberry ice cream? Then it wouldn't be the case that like the statement strawberry ice cream is good, when I say it is true. It would now be false if I said it. But I probably wouldn't say it because I don't have any particular reason to lie about that. So then I would say strawberry ice cream is not good or strawberry ice cream is bad. So if my attitude is different, then the statement I make would probably be different unless I had some motivation to lie or something. This is trivial, right? So if my stance changed, then statements I would make about what my stances are would change alongside them. There's nothing complicated about this. We already do this all the time with our food preferences and our music preferences. What if your food preferences change? Like I used to like something and now I don't like something. Then the way I speak about it would change. And
it's, what if they had different attitudes? Would it be wrong? And I think just by reflecting on the cases, you'll see, oh yeah, just because they think, one thing or another, that doesn't settle the moral fact about it.
Well, just because other people think differently than me doesn't settle facts about what I think. It does settle facts about what they think. So I reduce all of these to descriptive questions about what people think about the matter. Now, if you want to ask another question, then I'll give a different answer. But if you're asking the question, what is it that most people think? Well, that is determined by what most people think. If you're asking a question about what I think, that is determined by what I think. If you're asking a question about what stands independently wrong, well, then your question is, the answer is nothing. So like, as long as the question is clear, I can give a clear answer. But what Eric and a lot of other realists do is they want to vacillate between the normative claim in an undifferentiated way that carries pragmatic implications and that can be leveraged to give the impression that were one to say something other than like a full-throated, consistent endorsement of it being wrong, that this is somehow like awful, bad, or counterintuitive. So, for example, let's say you hold the view that your moral claim, like let's say you're a appraiser, individual subjectivist. So statements like X is wrong means something like X is inconsistent with my moral standards. Okay, so let's say you hold that view. Now someone might say, okay, so let's say that counterfactually you approved of baby torture. Well, now you would think it's true that baby torture is good. Yes, I would think that. What would that mean on my view? All it would mean on my view is that if I endorsed baby torture, or if I approved of baby torture, then I approve of baby torture, which is trivially true. That's all that would follow, because I don't think it works like this. If I approve of baby torture, that makes baby torture good in some special way that's reified and independent of me thinking it. And then everybody else has to agree that baby torture is good, or at least it's good for me to do it. That's not what I think. I just think the language of it is good just conveys my attitude. So it is good to torture babies would just convey, I approve of baby torture. And if you give me a counterfactual where I approve of baby torture, obviously it's true I approve of baby torture. And if we grant, for the sake of argument, that what it means to say baby torture is good is I approve of baby torture, then it's trivially true that baby torture is good would be true when I said it. That carries no implications for my current view. So it'd be like saying, wow, so if you approve of baby torture, you would approve of baby torture? Obviously, yes. No one would disagree with that. So how could that possibly be leveraged to show that the position is counterintuitive? The answer is it couldn't be. It couldn't be unless you rely on some type of equivocation or conflation to give the impression that my moral standards are contingent and up for grabs in a way where I might think you and other people should acknowledge the goodness of baby torture, when all I actually think is that you and others should acknowledge that if people approve of baby torture, they in fact do approve of baby torture. And I'm saying if they use language in a particular way, it carries that sort of an entailment analytically. It'd be the same as if I said, look, the way I use the term bachelor is to refer to an unmarried man. So if I were not married, then I would be a bachelor. That carries no implications for whether I'm actually a bachelor or not. I'm not, but if I were, then I would be. So like, there's just nothing follows from that other than fact about what words mean. So if you take a reductive individual appraiser subjectivist account, which is the closest approximation within contemporary analytic philosophy to the view that I hold, because I'm really just a quietist about this, If you take that view, I'm only making descriptive claims about the relation between certain meanings and certain other meanings. And then I'm making a further claim. That's what I'm doing when I say this. When I say this, I mean that. And maybe when other people say this, they mean that too. But I don't think most people are individual appraiser relativists. I don't think that they are. So I'm telling you something about my own language and my own view about what I mean by what I say and what I'm committed to. And there just aren't any of these horrific counterintuitive, like what are the counterintuitive implications to that? I just do think this way. So what would be counterintuitive? What am I supposed to reflect on to discover that I'm mistaken about this? That is what I mean when I say things. Now somebody says, but it's counterintuitive because what? Because things really are stance independently wrong? Okay, I don't have that intuition. I'm not disputing that realists have realist intuitions. I might in another context. In fact, I think I would. But setting aside that issue for now, if all the realist has to say is anti-realist claims run contrary to my realist intuitions, sure, good, okay. Now what? So if you think that that's wrong and you put a lot of stock in your intuitions, then don't endorse anti-realism. This seems like a private methodology, and it's not very interesting to me. And I don't think it's very dialectically meaningful. If realists just want to appeal to other people that share their private realist intuitions, be my guest, I guess, but I don't have them, and I don't see any particular reason to afford considerable epistemic weight to the realists that report having them. I don't particularly care. And why should I? So there's something off about the methodology here.
I mean, if you like whatever anti-realist proposal you have, I mean, I'm happy to hear it. And then we'll just, consider, oh, is that a plausible explanation for what makes it wrong to plow, through pedestrians at a crosswalk?
Well, so we have to be clear. Are we asking an empirical question about what I mean or what people in general mean? Or are we asking a metaphysical question? What kind of question are we asking? So is it a plausible explanation? Is moral claims are true in a way that stands dependent? Is that a plausible explanation of what I mean? Yeah, because I'm telling you that's what I mean. That is a plausible explanation. Is it a plausible explanation of what an ordinary person means? I don't know. Run a study. But now you need studies. Now it's not a question that you could figure out from the armchair. So it's not clear what question he's asking. It's not clear, is he asking a metaphysical question or an empirical descriptive question about what ordinary people mean? Are we talking about semantics? Are we talking about pragmatics? Are we talking about what ordinary people think? Or are we just asking what we, the individuals engaged in the dialectic, think? None of this is clear. None of this is clear. All right, let's have a look at the chat. Oh, wow, there's a lot of comments. So let me go back up. And I'm going to have to cut things off here and continue this later. All right, Digital says, yeah, I mean, they're trying to say that they're only suggesting that ordinary people would report it's bad to stab people. Yeah, quote only. I think it should be in quotes because I think there's something misleading about it. Temujin says also something can be bad or wrong in one context, but not another. That's true. So Digital goes on to say, which is super humble and defensible claim, but they're not committed to ordinary people report realist commitments. Yeah, so I don't know what to make of that, Digital. There's something funny about what's going on there. Digital continues, it's kind of like Ptolemaic epicycle in their theory, or maybe close to something like repressed memories. They believe this underneath by commitment to the normative claim. They just don't know. I do think this is really ad hoc and indefensible part of their theory, but they approach it in this direction to pre-bunk your claims, saying how they fit the reports we produced to pre-bunk your claims for their in-group. Yeah. Digital, you should say more about this because I think you have an interesting perspective on the matter about what's going on here with the pre-bunking. I don't know if you want to do a video on this or something, or I don't know, but you should talk about that. Because something funny is going on with the way people are saying this. I also don't think this is, and Digital, maybe you can answer this for me. Is this the way that realists were talking about this before I came along and talking about this stuff? Is this how they were talking 10 or 20 years ago? Because I think the answer is no. I think they were saying people are realists. I think they were saying that. And I think we could get examples of that. And certainly it would make sense to even talk about error theory because error theory explicitly holds that. Rayson says, I about had an aneurysm watching Sam Harris TED Talk on science can prove morality. Yeah, me too. I've seen that video multiple times. Sam Harris, it might be the most confused person of metaethics that I've ever seen or encountered in my life. I don't even know how he got twisted in such incredible pretzels, but he has no idea what he's talking about. And it's very sad. I'd be happy to talk to him. Obviously, he's never going to talk to me, but I'd be happy to talk to him about metaethics. So if somebody knows Sam Harris, I'd be happy to talk to him. Digital says that French guy has a paper on that. What on what? Are you talking about Edouard Machery? Because he does a lot of XY research. You are. It's funny because you say the French guy, and I immediately know it was Machery. He's great. I ran into him a couple years ago at a conference, and I don't think we'd spoken before in person, and he recognized me and knew my name and was very polite and friendly to me. I thought it was really cool that he somehow took the effort. Maybe he saw me in social media or something, but he's very cool and excellent researcher. Jeremy says I don't know. This is probably 20 minutes ago, 17 minutes ago. Jerry said he's conflating two senses of because. I don't know what you're referring to. Digital continues. He's probably also used to convincing people new to the topic in this direction. Moral claims for fretting realist explanation. Rayson says, IDL is that I don't like. You address the second claim on whether folk think plowing into people is sensibly wrong because it's in learning the difference they are no longer folk. What I don't know what you mean by IDL. Sorry. No Cakewalk says his phrasing is steeped in a priori assumption of moral realism. I think some of that is there's some truth to that. Still going through the chat, everybody. Andrew Moy says there's something weird about this method of saying, give me a position and I can knock it down. How do you know you can do that for all positions? Well, I think he's probably, to be fair to him, I think he's dealing with a restricted range of potential positions that he's already dealt with in the past. And I think that's why he's saying that. So I don't think it's that weird. Philo Dragon says, it sounds like he wants to say, in your view, there's no actually wrong answer to moral questions, just like there's no actually wrong answer on ice cream preferences, so nothing's actually wrong. Well, he hasn't said that, not here. So I wouldn't attribute that to him unless he says something like that. Yeah, Raceland, this is what I'm pointing to. So Raceland says, it's because you're linking the linguistic content to the propositions of the metaphysical status of what the proposition is pointing to. I don't see it. So they're separate questions here. And I think that they're not adequately and clearly disambiguating what's being asked and what we're trying to analyze and figure out. And Digital says, I don't think there is a linguistic content to propositions that points to anything. Right. So that's going to be an issue. It's really going to depend on background theories about philosophy of language. And if you hold a view like I do, some of what Sampson is doing might be incoherent. Like I can't do it within the framework that I'm operating in. And of course, contention on his framework being the right one, maybe you could do it, but there's certain things you can't do in certain frameworks. Like you can't analyze what God's will is under an atheist framework, obviously, because God doesn't have a will. Unless you just kept being null set. He doesn't have a will. He doesn't have a will. He doesn't have a will. But you can't compare competing accounts of what his will is that are substantive. Laborious says, what kind of metaphysical are you pushing or just in general? I don't know if that's directed at me, but I'm a pragmatist, and I like generally my views of the quietistic or anti-realist about most things. Man, so many remarks. Okay, everybody back and forth with each other. Great remark. I think language is behavior. Okay, everybody, I'm going to have to wrap it up there. I have other things that I have to do today. And let's see, I didn't even get 10 minutes into this. So let's at least get to 10-minute mark.
And I guess I have a bunch of arguments against basically any stance that you're going to give me. Reasons to think that no, that's not what explains why it's wrong to plow through people. And when you sort of work through all these stances, then you'll begin to think, oh, it looks like it doesn't depend on anyone's stance. It doesn't depend on God's. Doesn't depend on your mom's. Doesn't depend on the cultures. Doesn't depend on anything.
Did he say your mom's? That's pretty funny if he said that.
Or anyone's attitudes. But again, in order to substantiate that, we'd have to hear the proposal, and then we'd have to sort of work through it.
Yeah. So so my biggest issue, and I'll wrap the video up with saying this. My biggest issue is that I don't accept the method that he's using, that we first determine that it's wrong, and then we ask the question why. I think we have to first determine what it means to say that it's wrong. And in my case, I take myself to mean, and I take there to be this. I take there to be descriptive facts about what people approve of and disapprove of. There are descriptive facts about what cultures collectively approve of and disapprove of in a certain sense. There are descriptive facts about certain sorts of counterfactual considerations of what people would think under certain conditions. And I don't think that there are further facts. So Eric appears to want to chase this question of, okay, we've established that it is wrong. Now we need to ask the question, why is it wrong? But I don't think we have established that it is wrong. I agree. If you ask most people, is it wrong to stab a person just for interrupting you, that they would say yes to that. And so we could agree, most people would say yes to that question. What I'm not willing to do, one second. Sneeze came on me. All right. Let's see if that didn't scramble my brain. Okay. So I agree most people would respond to that question in that way. I don't think that establishes that we all agree that it is wrong in some undifferentiated way. I think when people answer that question, there's a further question about what it is that they're agreeing to. And I take there to be an empirical question about what it is people mean when they say yes in response to that question. And we first need to figure out what they mean. Then we could ask the question about whether what they mean is true. I don't think the proper method is to grant that it's true, that it's wrong, that most of us agree that it's wrong to stab a person for interrupting you. Then, now that we've agreed that that's true, just for the sake of argument, because we could, at the end of inquiry, decide, oh, it turns out we were wrong, error theory is true, and it's not true. We could figure that out, that we were wrong. We could have a revisionary position after the fact. So we grant, for the sake of argument, that's true, and now we start asking why. I don't think that makes sense. And the reason I don't think that makes sense is because competing meta-ethical accounts, with respect to the question about realism or anti-realism, begin with a thesis about what it means to say something is wrong. Right? They begin with that. And so it doesn't make sense to first grant that we agree that it's wrong, then figure out what we mean. I think we need to first figure out what we mean, then figure out whether the particular claim about what we mean is true or false. Does that make sense? I don't know what the audience thinks of that. So I think that there's something methodologically funky going on with the approach that he's taking. Maybe if he clarified the approach, I would have a better understanding of it and would find it more acceptable. But as stated here, this method is not one that I accept. And I do think, he clarified 5 minutes in. And of course, I paused. So I gave the impression it took him forever to clarify that he's not referring to stance independent stuff. But remember, I said that he could mean stance independent or not. He could mean this third thing, and it's unclear. So my objection was not that he's presupposing that it's stance independent. My objection, or maybe I said that initially, but my objection is that he's not being clear. Now, he did clarify later that he doesn't mean that it's stance independent. That doesn't mean it's clear what he does think, though. So I do think it's clear enough that he's referring to this third alternative. But the problem is that once we shift towards that third alternative and away from the determinate ones, now we move into the territory of whether there's problems with that third alternative. And I think that the problems with that third alternative are actually bigger than the problems with presupposing people are realists. That's at least more straightforward. I think it's wrong, but it's more straightforward. What he's proposing, I think, is more conceptually muddled. It relies on more background assumptions, probably. Certainly not how I think about it, and may end up involving, or at least heavily favoring, a methodology predicated on background assumptions that I think may not be true, and in any case are not very clear. So I think that, it's taken us almost 2.5 hours to get to 10 minutes of the video. I think we've spotted some pretty significant issues with how this issue is being approached from the outset. So I'll return to this video. This is really, really fascinating. And Eric, I don't know if you'll see this. I know I get all excited when I talk here. My genuine attitude about all of this stuff is, obviously, I love talking about this stuff. I really like talking to realists. I know we've spoke a few years ago. I would love to talk to you again. I really want to have positive conversations. I know sometimes due to the conflicts, people can be so flabbergasted or incredulous about another person's position. Sometimes this influences our tone in ways where it can cause hostility or condescension, or people have negative attitudes towards one another. I have zero negative attitude towards Eric. I know sometimes my audience gets really frustrated with people. So I'd love to talk to you. And I really, I want realists and anti-realists to get along. And the funny thing is, when people have exchanges through text, it can often be a lot more hostile. When they have exchanges on videos where they're not face to face, I think there's still some of that. But philosophers face to face love to have people with, at least most of them, not JP Andrew apparently, but most other philosophers besides JP Andrew. And yes, I am taking a dig at him specifically because I think it's true. He just blocked another person on Substack apparently just for disagreeing. Don't have a problem. His prerogative, block whatever you want. But he seems to have a problem with people disagreeing with him. But most philosophers that I've interacted with absolutely love to have people have contrary positions. And I've talked about it before. I had a roommate who was Catholic. He was like mega libertarian. He had all these views contrary to my own. He was a substance dualist. Just basically, if you took a checklist of views that are the opposite of my view about an issue or very, very different from it, he was like the whole checklist. And he's I've had other great roommates, but he was a phenomenal roommate. We're still good friends. We both have kids now. We trade baby raising tips and stuff like that. Some of his views on some of these matters have changed quite a lot. But there was nothing better in my experience as a graduate student than having a person with very, very different views on a whole bunch of different stuff, because it gives you such a rich opportunity to test your ideas against somebody with contrary views. And I really hope realists and anti-realists, I have some conflicts with some realists on Substack and some other places. I've occasionally run into people that, sometimes I shouldn't say sometimes, quite often I'm part of the problem with some of the angry talk, but some of them have not been so pleasant. And in some cases they did initiate or started it. Not that makes it okay for me to always retaliate. So I don't like those. I don't like that. I don't like that drama. I don't like people having conflict. We should not be fighting over abstract philosophical issues. At the end of the day, we're trying to figure out what's true. And most of us involved in these discussions, we agree on most of the basic issues. We agree on the basic matters of like human rights and civil liberties, and we want to live in similar sorts of worlds. There's a whole hypothetical realm of people with horrible, horrific ideas that we both collectively condemn and oppose. I am not at all in the camp of like some type of relativist that favors moral complacency and being really tolerant of people with horrible views. So, when it came down to how should people act in practice, if you took the whole gaggle of moral realists and the whole gaggle of like your nominal anti-realists, like people that say that they're relativists and stuff, I probably agree with the practical positions of the realists more than the anti-realists in practice, because I think that realists are typically in practice, again, these are not entailments of the positions, more okay with imposing their standards on people that don't share those values. I certainly, if you caught a person that had robbed a store, like robbed an old lady and punched her or something, and they said, wait, Lance, aren't you an individual appraiser relativist? I think it's fine to rob old ladies and punch them. Great. Someone's going to clip that. Now I'm really self-conscious of what people are going to clip. So if they said that, I would say, I don't care. I don't care what you think is okay. It's not okay to do that. I'm grabbing you and calling the police and you're going to jail and you're going to return the property, right? So the realist would have that reaction, and you could find a relativist who maybe you'd find a realist that has a weird reaction, like, I'm a realist, but that's okay to do. That'd be weird. But you could find quite a few relativists that would say, well, we shouldn't impose our standards on other people. What if they own slaves? What if they're torturing people? Yeah, but it's not our place to judge them. Yeah, fuck that. It is our place to judge them. If someone owns slaves or is torturing people, I'm judging them. And I'm not in favor of the type of anti-realism that says, let's kumbaya drum circle, not judge anybody. Bullshit. That's horrible. Horrible. I don't want people to die because of a stupid philosophical position. And I think moral realists, most of you probably agree with me. So when it comes down to it, I think we're on the same page on that kind of stuff. And to the extent that realists are not happy with relativism being leveraged to support public policy of non-intervention and non-judgment in cases that lead to mass amounts of human death and suffering, or even small cases of human death and suffering, I think that they have every business being upset with that and disliking it. And I think that could bleed over into an opposition to anti-realism. Anti-realism doesn't technically contain the entailments, but I think they have every business being pissed off about that. And I agree with them about that. So it's a bit, I'm trying to extend olive branches. Maybe that's a whole olive tree to realists that, there's probably a lot more of the basic everyday stuff that we agree on than we disagree on. And so these differences are really academic differences for the most part. And I just want to stress that. All right. Yeah, Hiroyuka Tanada says, I'm not sure overly non-judgmental people are like that because of abstract metaethics. I don't think that they are. I think that the language of abstract metaethics is leveraged to justify, rationalize, or argue for the behavior, but I don't think it's really doing much of the driving work. So, yeah, I think you're probably right about that, although maybe we have other disagreements about that. All right, everybody, I'm going to wrap it up there. I do have other stuff that I have to do. I'd really love to continue the video, but I'm moving this week and I have tasks. All right, everybody, I will catch you all later. Please like, subscribe, do all that stuff. And yeah, we hit 3,000 people in this video. So awesome. Take care, everybody. And I will see you all later. And Jeremy Gord gets 500 land salute for the cool suggestion. There. Don't want to have too much inflation. And all right, do all the stuff. And if you do leave a comment on this video, go subscribe to this channel and give it some views. And if you leave a comment, be respectful, be kind. Don't be an ass. All right. See y'all, everybody.